The following podcast is proudly brought to you by Vite Ramen. Use the link in the description and use offer code BROKENSILICON to get 10% off tasty, healthy, and easy to make ramen. And also use the offer code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Windows keys and die shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website at cdkeyoffer.com. Now on with the show. Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host. Let me see. What should I call it? I'll call myself TSR Tom. And today I am joined by a guest we've had on before, one that we talked about. You know, I said TSR, I believe that's the name of Epic's, competitor really to DLSS, or really their version that they think is superior to DLSS and FSR according to them. We talked about these things, I think, a little bit on our last episode, but we mostly talked about scaling performance with hardware and what devs look for in hardware. But this time, instead of 10 minutes, I want to have a major section be about the latest FSR 2.0 announcements, XeSS super sampling, and DLSS. So, yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Bryan Heemskerk. I'm the art director at Massive Damage. So I've worked in the game industry for the last, 11 years. Various projects. Started mobile, which we touched on the last time, but the last 6.5 years I've been indie completely. And anyways, yeah, I've art directed a lot of games, shipped tons of games for various platforms. The last two big ones we did were Halcyon 6 and Star Renegades, which were PC primarily, but they also got console ports and things like that. Happy to talk about any of these things with you.
Yeah, so I don't know how much more of an introduction there really is. I think, it was already almost a year ago when we talked. I think one of the most interesting things I remember, a thing that stuck in my mind that you said was, I like asking devs, what do they wish they could have in the consoles? What's the first thing they would upgrade? And the Sony Santa Monica person said, please, 32 gigabytes of RAM.
Yeah.
I believe the Obsidian developer also said, please, 32 gigabytes of RAM over at Xbox.
Yeah.
And you said, can I just have 100 teraflops?
Yeah. I listened to our talk again just to make sure that I at least continued the conversation instead of rehashing things. But I was like, I said that I'm pretty sure most people are going to say RAM was what I said. But then almost every time I've seen how developers use RAM, we typically exceed its use and then optimize down. And it didn't seem to matter how much RAM it was. I know there are a lot of specific use cases where a lot of RAM is super helpful. I personally RAM gives you more breadth, right? And a lot of developers want more breadth to do those kind of things. So getting 32 gigs would be huge, but it's like, I can't even imagine the way the PCBs would look with that much RAM on board for, consoles or things like that. You get a ton of bandwidth, which would be good if you set it up as multiple modules, but then you have like RAM modules on both sides of the board and all of those kind of things. And
well, the PS4 did that though.
Oh yeah,
which
totally
surprised everybody. Actually on that note, someone who, contributes to Moore's Law's Dead a lot, Carbon Cry, said something in the Moore's Law's Dead Discord a few days ago, which was that, and this stemmed from me suggesting that there's a chance AMD may go with 8 gigabytes of RAM on it may be the 7600 XT, it may be the 7700 XT. I'll probably do a leak about this pretty soon. But in other words, this is Navi 33, and it's targeting kind of like what the 6600 XT was to the 5700 XT, except now it's the 7600 XT to the 6900 XT. So around 6900 XT performance, probably lower in 4K, probably higher in 1080p, much smaller bus, similar amount of infinity cache, I think. And it only has 8 gigabytes of RAM. And I said, I think it just comes down to pricing. Like, I think 8 gigabytes is, enough for 1440p. I think. Would it be nice if it had 16 gigabytes? Maybe, but I have a feeling they would rather make it a $400 8 gigabyte card than a $550 16 gigabyte card if its performance is at all competitive with higher tier Nvidia products. And, Carbon Cry pointed out, I guess there's probably a lot of things you want to respond to now. But,
I'm thinking.
But Carbon Cry said, I think there's an obsession with RAM because we were like doubling RAM and it mattered so much to go from 2 GB to 3 GB, but it's so much to go from 3 to 4 and 4 to 6. But looking at Ampere, whether we like it or not, I mean, Ampere really, in my opinion, skimped on RAM for the majority of the lineup.
Yeah.
But it added a ton of teraflops, and it seems like both RDNA 3 and Lovelace are going to add just a mountain. You're going to get your way. I think you're going to get 100 teraflops.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much RAM some of them will have, and you almost wonder, like, were devs putting more and more stuff in RAM at first because they kind of had to for the better textures, but then just because that was an easy way to space things out for performance? Like, might we just use compute more than we used to and not worry about RAM as much moving forward, at least linearly? Like, I don't think we're going to have 64 GB cards in a few years. We went from 1 GB to like 6 GB in like 4 years. I don't see us, was it sectupling RAM in the next 5 years? Like, what do you think about scaling performance in the future, leaning into teraflops, just because that's what GPUs seem to have a lot more of now?
Well, it's kind of interesting because there's so many ways I can go from just even that question, because it's such a wide question. I'll try to tackle individual components of it. Some engines are really good at scaling RAM. Like if you look at like, I think RE engine's a really good example of that. There's a couple of engines like that even if you don't have enough RAM, it kind of already manages it. It'll manage assets. You're not going to get crazy chugging performance. Some games don't. It really is engine dependent, like how good their memory management is in engine. And some games will be fine. Like that would probably be the craziest esports card that you could ever have. Because so it's like, if you're talking about targeting a specific market, it's like, will that have limitations in some upcoming games in the next 2 or 3 years? Totally. Unless it's a really good engine that has really good memory management. But I really see that being like a crazy esports card, because you get so many frames per second, and as long as the game fits in the RAM, you're fine. It's just, I guess it would be restrictive in the future. I was kind of surprised that you said that it looked like it had the same amount of infinity cache, because I was thinking, like, first thing that came to my mind is maybe they're offsetting it with either infinity cache or they're going to offset
it. Well, they kind of are inadvertently, right? Because they're giving, this is Navi 33. This is, I think, really targeting a cost to produce in between Navi 22 and Navi 23. So it's not like this tiny cheap thing like 23 was, the 6600 XT. But it's certainly, I think, intended to not cost more to make than the 6700 XT. So I think you just got to think about like what they're targeting this at, and they're giving this more infinity cache than the 6600 XT, than the 6700 XT. Yes, a smaller bus, half the bus, but I think we've seen a lot of cards do a lot with infinity cache, and I think it's worth remembering the RAM is probably going to be 50% faster than the 6900 XT as well. So,
well, there's another thing that kind of crossed my mind, in that maybe there's secret sauce that we haven't anticipated yet, in the sense
it's very possible
that they're working on kind of their version of either direct storage or the like the same kind of decompression compression engines they put in the PlayStation and the Xbox on hardware, and that transferring from like NVMe SSDs to memory might be faster in the future. So the amount of RAM on the card may be less. I don't know. That would take a surprise announcement from AMD when they're outlining the new architecture. But
I'd say two things to what you said, though, right? I mean, I've been warned numerous times that, guys, RDNA 3 is not just RDNA 2 with magic more IPC. It's probably going to be organized in a radically different way.
Yeah.
Ampere doesn't look like Turing, So I there is better memory management in RDNA 3 inherently that I'm sure helps with some of that. But at the same time, I think, again, it comes down to cost. It's like if you tell me, oh, there's a $600 card with only 8 GB of RAM that hampers its 4K performance. People point out the 3070, and I'm like, yeah, that's the problem I had, is because it was like usually $600.
Yeah.
If the 3070 was $350, whatever, I'll turn down textures, man. I don't care that it has that level of performance. And I think that there's no way around it. AMD, I think, does want this to not do as well at 4K. They want you to buy the more expensive thing.
Well, 4K is a weird niche on PC, right? Like the vast majority of PC gamers, because all of my friends that buy PCs typically ask me which parts they should buy. So one of the things that comes up a lot is like when they're buying their monitors, it's like a lot of them will opt for high frame rate, like high refresh rate, 1440p or 1080p monitors instead of going 4K. So if AMD targeted like
Mm-hmm.
specifically like, hey, this card is for like 200 frames per second at,
1440p or
1440p,
something. Yeah.
then who cares, right? It's like if they really, or so it's either one of those two questions. Either it's really targeting a specific demographic, or they may have made the need for an insane amount of RAM less important.
I think it's both. I think it has to be both. And I think that they say, at the end of the day, even if we call it the 7700 XT, even if it's $500, we added $20 to the cost of the 6700 XT and added 50% more performance. Are you really going to complain it has less RAM that we added 50% performance for almost the same price? I think that's the argument AMD would make, but I don't think they're going to make that argument unless they raffle stomp Nvidia. Like if Nvidia has a really great lineup, then they're like, oh, maybe we won't milk this card, But I think that's also an aspect of it people need to think about.
How many people fixate on, like, I guess this kind of comes to the Halo product debate, right? Because if both AMD and Nvidia have like whatever the 7900 XT and the 4090 or whatever, and they have ludicrous amounts of RAM, then and whatever one's on top there often feeds a lot of the argument, and then people will be like, well, this one's on top, and then they buy the lower end one without looking as deeply into that card. There's several friends I have that bought 30.
The 6900 XT has 16 gigabytes. AMD made a big deal about RAM. And then next to me is the 6500 XT I'm testing. They're like, oh, yeah, but that one is 4 gigabytes.
Yeah,
sorry.
Well, I mean, the vast majority of people don't even... I'm surprised how often when I'm talking to someone about buying computers, how much they actually factor in RAM. They'd be like, but this is an 8 gigabyte card, and this is a... And I'm like, GPUs are like compositions of compute units with sets of arrays of shaders and TMUs and ROPs, and it's like RAM, as long as you have enough, oftentimes you can tell right away when you have a game that is putting out too high res textures for whatever you have, and then your frame rate starts chugging, and then I'm in a RAM deficiency scenario. But a lot of the other cases, it's like most of the time it's like, is there enough for it to work? And so it's a weird thing, but people are looking for numbers. It's like there's so many GPUs. It's like shaders are like the structure of the GPU is so critical, and the clock speed to how it performs. But it's like those are the hardest things to read on the specs. It'll be like on the box. It'll be like GDDR6 and
I know.
And 8 gigabytes of RAM.
This like marketing term, 7 nanometer. It's not even really 7 nanometer.
Yeah,
They're like 7 nanometer, 16 gigabytes, GDR6X or something. Yeah. That, or I mean, Vega advertising HBM all over the place. Even though
HBM2. Yeah.
It had the same bandwidth as the 1080 Ti, but
which is funny because the Fury X had like a crazy amount of bandwidth, but didn't have much RAM speed. It was like the opposite. I think it had double the bandwidth of the Vega 64, but that's just going off the top of my head.
It had double the bus width. It actually had a 5% more bandwidth.
5% more bandwidth. So it was like too much in that case. It didn't have the shader throughput to feed it, but yeah.
Well, you bring up, we're on the subject of GCN, and this leads perfectly into the first reader mail. So Loophole35 writes in. He says, good evening, Tom and Bryan. With raster performance growing exponentially, it seems with the latest architectures that it still baffles me that this technology or method of upscaling, I'm talking about DLSS, FSR, XE super sampling soon, is just now being pushed. I get the idea that now we have ray tracing and it makes games with ray tracing easier to run, but couldn't we have used this a long time ago in the late 28 nanometer stagnation era with Kepler and GCN? We had low-end cards back then, barely able to do 1080p 90 hertz, and I mean, and it's true. Like the 290X's big marketing point was it could run 4K at all, like at 30 frames. It is true. We could have used FSR back then much more. I will say though that my answer immediately is they hadn't even gotten around to worrying about that yet.
Well, some devs had, and we hired a few months ago a really amazing rendering developer who worked at Koei Tecmo for like 10 years. I don't know how many years, but they worked on Neo 2 and like all sorts of the console ports, the PC ports for all of that kind of stuff. And we had kind of an interesting talk. So he was saying that with FSR 1.0, you have to, it takes it, if you're doing it in the actual game, you have to do it at the anti-aliasing pass, because you want it to be in that specific pass, because then it doesn't interfere with your overlays and your UI and stuff like that, right? With FSR 2.0 and that, it has to go earlier in the render pipeline. Same with DLSS. because you need temporal information. Now, some engines already give this to you. And this is kind of the thing, is it's going to be less implementable. My guess is it's less implementable than FSR 1.0. So you're not going to be seeing it in
I think that's pretty obvious in how they're talking about it, right? When the FSR 1.0 was announced, it was like, oh, it takes 2 hours to add. And they were like making these huge claims. And I'm looking at there and they're like, we can make it take 4 weeks to 3 days. And I'm like, this is a very different time scale, which you said about 1.0, guys.
If you look at FSR 1.0, I mean, people are just taking it and they're putting it in emulators. Like the Steam Deck just put it in the OS. So it's implementing it like everywhere because it's so easy. Yeah, at that point, you're putting it at the absolute end of the frame and then it's doing it to UI and stuff that you probably don't want. But it's interesting how flexible of a technology it is versus when temporal has much better results. And I mean, it can have some issues with ghosting and motion and things like that, but it has major strengths because, I mean, did you check the Matrix demo out for Unreal 5?
I did. And you go first. What do you have to say about it? I did check it out.
Well, they have a section where you turn on their temporal solution and off. And it's amazing the difference with that specific one. It's like, mind you, it's like, I'm curious because when you play the actual game, there's like a lot of haloing around the character, and I'm not
There's a ton of haloing. Like, it was actually distracting for me.
Yeah, it was. So that was I'm like glad we're noticing the same things. It makes it easy to talk about. But it's like, I don't know if that's a byproduct of how aggressive their temporal solution is. And this is kind of, I know something you wanted to touch on is it's something where in theory, AI super sampling might be able to make up for, where a purely temporal solution might not. But you'd have to test these things, right? We'd have to check out algorithms and see whether they're actually doing it to make. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that personally, but.
Well, so let's back up though and start with DLSS before we get to FSR again, because I just kind of want to set a baseline at the, and again, I made videos where I was like, let's be very clear, FSR isn't the same thing as DLSS. I know if we even talk about them in the same breath, there are, for some reason, always people that get mad we're comparing them, but I'm just going to put this disclaimer out in the beginning, everybody. AMD's making FSR because DLSS exists. They didn't start working on this, and then, so it is basically competing with DLSS, though. Whether you guys, I think, that's my opinion at this point, whether you admit it or not, it's at least there to nullify an advantage Nvidia is marketing that they have right now. And there's just, it's not the same technology, it doesn't work the same way, but at the end of the day, we're trying to make images look better or have games get better frame rates than they would otherwise without noticing a degradation in quality. And I know DLSS right now argues it looks better than native, but going back to DLSS 1, I mean, what did you think about it? Because I do not think it looked better than native when it first came out.
DLSS 1 didn't look better than native. It looked like smeary. There was a lot of like weird smeariness that was happening on screen. I think DLSS 2 is where that dramatically improved. But yeah, I see. The thing is that DLSS versus FSR 1 are dramatically different because they're
they are.
One's spatial, one's taking a mixture of temporal and AI. Whereas FSR 2 is probably 70 to 80% more similar. And that's, and then the question is how much is your temporal motion vectors? So a lot of it is motion vectors just tracking pixels on previous frames and then knowing where to put them on new frames, from what I understand. So we're talking about the need for temporal, right? And for visual upsampling. And the main reason that there's a need for it is probably the law of diminishing returns. So if you look at the GPU difference between like a base PS4 to a PS5, it's like, what is it? It's 1.8 teraflops going to 10. So it's like a 5.5 times increase in just raw throughput. Obviously, there's a lot of architectural innovations that come along with that. So, I mean, if you go from 1080p to 4K, that's already taking up a huge portion of that budget. So people are buying the high-end TVs and they want to take advantage of them, right? And we want to deliver something that's filling those pixels. However, how they should fill them. If we want the game to look as good as it humanly possibly can, we probably should set the resolution target at something like 1440p and do the rest via some scaling algorithm, right? Because the reality is even in native 4K games, because of that problem I was telling you before of just how harsh the raster output is of one side of the pixel, is that they can look pretty like I've seen games with a good temporal upscaling solution that look better on a 4K TV than games that are native 4K on that TV, just from having better upsampling technology, and that they're accommodating for some of these stray pixels, let's say, right? So it's like, it's two things. They don't want to go native 4K because then they can't make the game look as good as they want, right?
Mm-hmm.
They want to up the resolution somewhat to like 1440p or something, but then scale the rest of the way. And I think that everyone was having this problem. They want the games to look as good as humanly possible. The engines are being developed with these tools in mind. And this is something that I was going to talk about with FSR 2.0 and DLSS is modern engines are already kind of built with motion vectors in place and things that are necessary. So it's like Unity and Unreal both have motion vectors ready to use DLSS and things like this now. There's specific parts with Unity. It means that you have to use the HDRP pipeline, I think. You can't use their legacy rendering pipeline. So, and there's strengths and caveats that come to changing your rendering pipeline for that. But anyone who essentially already has built the framework where they can include DLSS should be able to include FSR because it's using more or less the same information. Now, Nvidia and XeSS, which you mentioned here, is looking into using AI upscaling for at least part of it. I don't know what that looks like yet. And the thing
for
is,
Xe, no, we don't really know yet.
when I was talking to Wendell from Level 1 Tech about this, and he was telling me that the training is the part where AI is needed the most. So training, but once you have it trained, you could kind of run that algorithm on most things. You might not be able to run it as quickly.
Right, which is my understanding of what NVIDIA's doing right now. You know, they have one thing that they train and improve in the back end, and they're like, this is the algorithm, this is DLSS 2.3. We've made these improvements with the latest one. You know, and I do want to, that's a good point, though, like, the whole AMD working on FSR on their own because it just makes sense, basically, is how I might condense what you said there. I mean, because at a certain point, going from PS2 to PS3, it's like, I don't even know the difference in gigaflops it was back then. It's like 100, I don't know, 100 times more. It's an absurd amount more. Like, but that, it's like, yeah, we'll make the game look 10 times better because we have 100 more gigaflops.
Yeah.
But now it's like, yeah, so we have 10 times the teraflops. It's not going to look 10 times better. We're going to need to make up for this crossing of the uncanny valley because it's going to take 10 times the teraflops to do it. And we don't, I mean, we'd rather, frankly, people would rather use that for rendering or mining probably than playing a game at that point. So we need to do something with upscaling. So I agree that AMD was certainly probably working on this in the background, and everyone undoubtedly has been. I mean, you see a lot of first-party studios, like Sony specifically, they've got a lot of their own stuff clearly figured out with upscaling in a lot of those games without FSR. But I don't know. I just feel like DLSS made it more urgent, and I guess this actually makes me think of something that about DLSS 1.0 as well. Do you believe NVIDIA, from the inception of Turing, was thinking about using the tensor cores for like something like DLSS 1.0? Or do you think they designed Turing mostly for ray tracing, knew it wouldn't be useful to gamers for years, and then found a way to use some of those components for the original version of DLSS, which to my knowledge doesn't really use those cores anymore for DLSS, I don't think, actually.
No, I don't think it does for DLSS.
I think it did it first.
It did it first, but I don't think it does anymore. Okay. So,
but you see my question, do you think NVIDIA intended from the beginning to have tensor cores to use DLSS? Or my suspicion the whole time was, no, it was for ray tracing, and they found a way to use them for DLSS.
Well, the RT cores are different than the tensor cores, right? So
yes, they are.
They're different components on the GPU, but okay.
But I believe the tensor cores do the denoising and ray tracing.
Yes,
right?
they do. They help with the denoising. So, okay. NVIDIA loves proprietary things, and they have been insanely in love with it since CUDA.
Mm-hmm.
Since they've been able to corner CUDA entirely, they've been absolutely in love with their proprietary technologies, because if they can claim complete ownership, they can force scenarios. And this is something I wanted to get into with you, that AMD probably has the only chance it has for severe market share in the next 3 years. And I have a thought on that, but like somewhere in the next 3 to 5 years. But that's something we can get into in a minute. And NVIDIA saw it as an opportunity to incorporate this. The hardware was there. They were doing it because they wanted one design that they could push across all of their server GPUs, would be my guess, right? Mm-hmm. And then if they can find secondary uses for it in gaming, great. Right now, it's just kind of like an open, and I know at some points in the past, you may have mentioned that you're like, should they even put it on GPUs? And I'm like, my stance is I feel like they should have machine learning on the GPUs, not for any current implementation, but for things they might think of later. Like, I think the most interesting examples aren't really like DLSS or something like that. I think that
So
Microsoft.
my opinion 2 years ago, I've heard it quoted like that, but my opinion, the way I'd phrase it, and my opinions have changed since
Totally.
then, but 2 years ago, what I thought about the tensor cores was not necessarily that they were a bad idea, but that they were clearly not gamer first, and that they might not be as much of the die space if this was truly a gamer first architecture, and that now they're married to them and they kind of have to use them
Yeah,
because you're using like 20% of your die space or something for it anyways. But they clearly didn't need them. They had versions of
yeah.
Turing without tensor cores, the 1600 series. So they could have just had probably 20% more teraflops and not worried about it if they wanted to. Well, so, but the funny thing, and to transition a little more than about DLSS 1.0 is eventually they kind of stopped. My understanding is they don't even use the tensor cores anymore in
Yeah.
DLSS because it added latency and it just wasn't a good idea. It didn't make any sense. And it's funny how it almost seems like FSR 2.0 is now becoming more DLSS-like as well. And they're starting to converge slightly in how they work a little bit. But before we get to FSR 2.0, I do want to get to a section here where, like, how would you describe how FSR 1.0 works? Because it's changing a lot to 2.0.
Yeah, well, it's going from a spatial to a temporal upscaler. A spatial upscaler, you can either just take the frame and do it to, or you can do it in the anti-aliasing pass if you want. So wherever you would be putting whatever FXAA or MSAA or whatever anti-aliasing TAA into your pipeline, you would be able to kind of implement FSR 1.0 there. This is for the dev that I was asking a bunch of questions about this too, the rendering dev. And whereas FSR 2.0, you can have no choice but to put it earlier in the pipeline around when you're accumulating motion vectors and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, you're not going to get the crazy, because you're not going to get the crazy use cases of FSR 1.0 that we're getting, like emulators, just people injecting it into emulators because it's so easy to put anywhere in the pipeline. Or
we're not going to get that with 2.0.
You probably, well, I mean, I'm not going to say that conclusively. There might be a way, but it's going to be harder to do. It might be easier to do for people who own, like, it's easier for, let's say, Unreal to go in and put this, because it's easy. It's more of an engine level thing rather than a driver level thing, or because we're seeing RSR, which is injecting 1.0 into the driver level. We're seeing the Steam Deck, which is putting it in the OS level. We're seeing where the FSR 1.0 is so flexible, you can kind of just put it anywhere. By going to temporal, they're fighting the notion that it's an inferior product to DLSS because the visual output will be better. There's a chance of ghosting. There's a chance of all of that, although it won't be bad if it's going from like 1440p to 4K. The biggest risk for it is if it's going lower, then it's going 1080p or lower. But you're going to get some artifacting, you're going to get some ghosting, maybe, unless they've really improved the algorithm, because they're not all equal, right? You look at some of Sony's solutions with Ratchet and Clank and Spider-Man both use a form of TAA. God of War, I'm pretty sure, uses TAA. Like, all of these have temporal solutions, and it's like varying quality, right? It's like they're all pretty good. Like, I like the RE engine ones. The other thing to keep in mind is with lower resolution buffers, and you can see it kind of with the FSR2 video demo, is oftentimes effects are tied to lower resolutions, right? So it's like, it could be your shadow resolutions, or it can be your ambient occlusion, or it can be your there's all of these different aspects of game graphics, and you might have, or your volumetric lights, let's say you have those at like quarter res or half res. So what you could end up with on FSR 2.0 is some of those having more artifacting, and it might be harder to make those things completely tangible. But and that's going to be an issue with anything lowering resolution, and that's something that maybe deep learning could compensate for, the lower resolution effects that are being blended together, whereas a pure TAA solution won't have that. So I don't know. Like, I would have to really, this is, if I was at GDC right now, I would be at these conferences asking those exact questions to Nvidia and AMD engineers. And
well, so what do you think about the quality, just generally speaking? Have you used FSR?
I have. Well, I've used FSR 1.0. I've used all of these. I feel like sometimes it's fine. Actually, I feel like low res on PC isn't great, but on the Steam Deck, sometimes I can't even notice that I turn it on. It's kind of an interesting.
It depends on the game and the scene, though, because I've been starting to mess with it on the 6500 XT next to me, and I was surprised at what resolutions I thought it actually still looked fine, especially when I've seen some comparisons, online on YouTube where it just looks horrible. But at least so far, when I'm testing, FSR seems pretty dang impressive to me, even in 1.0, to be honest. I don't know that it looks as good as the best DLSS that I've tried, but it looks pretty good.
DLSS looks amazing most of the time. I feel like there's just weird edge cases where there's strangeness to it, like the doors and control, and in the shutters, there's like blinds with the individual shutters in Cyberpunk, and they go kind of crazy. Like there's something about it that actually hurts me to look at them, and if I turn DLSS off, it looks fine. So there's something about either how the temporal information is calculating where pixels should be that's not consistent on a frame-to-frame basis in extremely dense textures, or areas where the lighting isn't consistent enough from frame to frame, and it's like the calculations for DLSS are off by 1 pixel one direction or another too often on a frame-by-frame basis. And that I don't see that as much with FSR, but the overall image quality is better with DLSS. I think all of these image upsampling techs are fascinating. I think that, they're definitely the future. But it's which one's going to win out? And this is kind of what I was mentioning. AMD has one of the biggest chances it has, because as a game artist who has to work in a lot of different tools, whatever, ZBrush, Maya, Photoshop, everything, it's like NVIDIA's embeddedness makes it harder to work on Radeon hardware, even if Radeon hardware is better. So let's say if whether it is or whether it isn't is irrelevant, it's like the software solutions are so ubiquitously, we said that wrong, tied to NVIDIA. And it's like, but AMD has its biggest chance in the next and somewhere between 2 to 5 years, because I guarantee Unreal is working on all of the things that every other 3D software is currently doing. I guarantee they're working on a 3D modeling. I guarantee they're working on all of that stuff. And when you have one solution, instead of several software packages that have allegiances to a specific hardware vendor one way or another, then there is an opportunity for just winning with straight up hardware. Because right now it's really like, to be honest, between RDNA 3 and Lovelace, it's like, even if RDNA 3 was 30 to 40% more powerful, let's say, it would be almost impossible to shift developers of video games over to it with the current ecosystems. What they would need is a software, and I'd love to talk to AMD about this because I have some ideas, but it's like of what they could do. But this is a window they have to take advantage of, because tools are starting to aggregate by engine holders, and that's their primary opportunity to get in.
I was doing some research, in preparation for this episode, and I looked around at adoption, because I think it's coming down to adoption a lot of the time. Because I have a lot of games that, just a year ago, I was still kind of calling DLSS a joke, and now whether it's Battlefield or, let me think, or Metro or Mountain Blade Bannerlord, a lot of my games now support DLSS, and it makes a big difference in some of them for what my graphics card can run. And I think AMD made the argument that they're going to get a ton of adoption quickly because it's easier to implement. And right now, based on what I've seen reported, at least I've read something on PC Mag, that AMD has FSR support in 80 games and that DLSS is in over 150. And so AMD would say, well, DLSS had like 3 games in its first year. We have 80 games in our first year. We're getting adopted way faster. We'll overtake them soon. But here's the interesting thing. I thought, let me look into this, though. A year ago, when FSR came out, DLSS was in 40 games. So in the year FSR has been out, AMD's got adoption in 80 games. NVIDIA's got adoption in an additional 110. So actually, although AMD's being taken up quicker, more games are adopting DLSS per month than FSR right now. And I think that's a major issue for AMD if they're tied, though, because a lot of the games with DLSS don't have native FSR support because NVIDIA doesn't want them to.
Yeah, well, this is okay, I can answer this in I could talk about this in 3 ways that I think of. The uptake is partially sponsorship and support, and the other uptake is partially engine readiness. is that our engines or game engines were not ready for current gen. They weren't ready for modern PCs. By modern PCs, I mean anything RDNA 1 to 2 and above, and anything from the GeForce 2000 series and above. And now our engines are catching up. And so, for instance, all of these games that are now, all these new games are being built on engines that already have motion vectors incorporated. In the year that DLSS came out, very few engines had that built in. So updating our engines to have the kind of the precursor technologies to even
That's
do
true,
this
yeah.
is,
Because I think they needed like DX12 even for like DLSS, and like, yeah, there are entire agents that just couldn't add DLSS.
so I can kind of touch on this in an interesting way, because I think one of the weirder things about Nvidia's stranglehold on the PC industry is where it holds games back. Not that they push games forward in some regards and they hold games back in others. I don't want to be completely hard on them, but
I would agree with both of those statements. I think that we can't pretend they don't push things forward sometimes, but at the same time, feels like whatever they do, in my opinion, to push things forward half the time comes with a lot of caveats where I'm worried it's going to be more of like a snapback in reality.
Yeah, so I can name it with a specific example. So when I was talking to the dev that worked on Neo 2, they were talking about doing all of at the time, it was the PS4 Pro optimizations. So they implemented half floats all over the place. And it was kind of funny because the half floats, they got like a huge performance boost when they switched to half floats, but there was like tons of graphic artifacts. So it's like, and you only notice them in certain areas, like the sky, the banding and gradations between the colors.
Oh, yeah.
And then people were like, why'd the sky go so weird? And they didn't notice it in like 90% of the textures that they made the difference, but then they had to go and manually tag any textures where they noticed where they were and then change them to full 32-bit floats. Right. And one of the interesting things is when they went to go to the PC port, they scrapped all of the AMD optimizations because GeForce didn't have half floats at that point in time. GeForce didn't have asynchronous compute. So the PC version actually flagged, they got rid of a lot of their AMD optimizations to support DirectX, to support all of this. So it's like, I remember all these conversations of being like, oh, well, we'll optimize for the hardware and then PCs will take advantage of it. But I've seen examples where devs have had to scrap optimizations to reach a wider PC audience.
No, that's interesting because I see that happen all the time where you'll get games that seem pretty dang well optimized that run better than most of their peers for the performance you're getting on the consoles that have AMD hardware. Then you go to PC and it's just a complete Nvidia sponsor fest.
Well, I think that the worst and the most egregious example of that, in my opinion, was God of War. And that people praising it as this really good PC port when I feel it's the exact opposite. That's my personal stance. It's just, so they went from like having some of the most robust particle simulations being done in asynchronous compute using all of these interesting hardware features. And then they go DirectX 11, lose complete access to all asynchronous compute and having massive, and it performs terribly on Radeon compared to GeForce. They do really well on GeForce cards. And it's such a weird thing for a game that was so beautifully optimized for Radeon. So it's like to go to PC and literally cut all of its really well thought out optimizations for Radeon hardware. It's a strange thing. And I was trying to get to something specific about Nvidia pushing games forward and holding them back. And I feel like this is kind of where the crux of that conversation is. And it's like, I really respect Nvidia every time they engineer new features. It's like, I'm actually fairly up on RTX cores and I like any new hardware innovations. When they pull things in silicon and they try new things, I'm always excited for those because it makes new ideas for the future. When you scrap out hardware, I'm less interested. When you're, let an API go way past its usefulness, it's something that bothers me. And, it's like, I think we see a lot of these kind of things with hardware. Like, so with FSR 2.0 and DLSS, they get injected into the same part of the pipeline with 2.0. Now, if you have the setup in place for DLSS, you have the setup in place for FSR in modern games. So the thing is that developers on console are going to be taking advantage of FSR 2.0 or some version of temporal upscaling. So the weirder thing that we have to watch for looking forward is when developers have that tech in consoles and they scrap it on PC. I think that if there's anything to look for, it's that. because
You mean like specifically FSR 2.0 on a console, but
yeah,
not on PC?
if they're,
Do you think that would really happen? You know how bad that would look?
I don't
Like,
know. I'm just
what
saying,
would AMD
what?
say? But I mean, you're right though. Arguably, they're doing worse than that now. We just don't know because most people don't pay attention to like the P16 performance and stuff and how a game
Yeah,
works.
totally.
But you're right. You could argue they are doing that.
So I like, if I bring out the example of the God of War port and Neo 2, those are specific examples where developers had to do that, right? And they probably have good reasons. I'm not trying to badmouth those. I mean, it does open them up to a much wider much wider user base, and they might have no choice in that. It just financially makes sense. But I think that if you were looking for sketchy happenings, it would be games that already have those features turned off, especially when it runs both anyways. Like if the console version ships with FSR 2.0 and the PC version only ships with DLSS, that's kind of like a stranger thing. And that we won't know for 2 years whether that's the case or not, but those would be examples to look for.
Today's video is brought to you by CDKeyOffer.com. As I put together a new benchmarking station for 2022, I know that whether it's running Windows 10 or Windows 11, I will be getting that key from CDKeyOffer.com. And that's because it's a reliable, long-term sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead that gets you reasonable prices on legitimate keys for these types of products. But it's really not all that they offer. They also can give you keys for Microsoft Office, keys for PlayStation codes, and even some of the latest PC releases like Elden Ring, a game that I'm enjoying quite a bit. Whatever you need, CDK Offer probably has you covered. And they're always running sales, but make sure you use the best code possible. And that's the ones provided for the Moore's Law is Dead fans. Moore's Law is Dead fans get the biggest discount. And if you go to the link on screen or in the description, you can use code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Microsoft products and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. Using these codes really does help Moore's Law is Dead, and it helps you pay reasonable prices for games that you want and keys that, frankly, you just have to use half of the time. So, again, use the link in the description, use Broken Silicon, use DieShrink depending on the products you're getting, and pay reasonable prices for keys today at CDKeyOffer.com. You know, what do you think about it in the other direction? Like, for example, I look at a game like Far Cry 6 and it has FSR on PC. Why does it not have FSR on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X when it was a dynamic resolution, usually below 4K? I mean, if they turned FSR on, couldn't they have just hit 4K locked 60 with no frame drops? I mean, what are they?
It might have just been like an engine-based setup on their part when they were making the games. Like the way that tools interface with consoles when you're doing builds and stuff, you might implement features in one that's a set. Like they can be islands from one another. Like at a certain point, there's like kind of like a splitting point in a game's development where you could end up managing like 3 code paths that are optimizations for different hardware. And there's especially it's hard to even look at it right now because I think it's more of a factor when you look 2 or 3 years down the road because it's first of all it's different teams when you get to that big. If you're getting a AAA game, right, and you have a PC team, a porting team, and there could be just people on those teams that are excited about different technologies or people that are uninterested. But when you go a few years down the road and all of these things are done at an engine level, then it's going to be more transparent, right? It's like for the startup of a generation, like they weren't sure whether they had hardware support for some of these things. I mean, it's clear now FSR 1.0 could be put anywhere. You can put it on an emulator, you can inject it. And, you know, it'd be interesting to see what happens after these Nvidia leaks with how proprietary their hardware is. So it's like, because, I mean, CUDA has been their breadwinner for a long time. And if somehow that gets broken open, that would change a lot. But
so you wouldn't read into it too much on FSR not being in a lot of console games yet. You're just saying you just wouldn't read into it. It's not a surprise because it's new.
Yeah, I would say that like wait for like, I mean, devs are usually really game focused and not that tech. Some are like this is the thing about stating anything outright like that is there are more tech focused devs and there are devs that are really focused on making their particular game, and you know it just might not be something that even comes into their train of thought if they're just focusing on shipping a game, right? But then the other thing to keep in mind is that like all of these people in a studio are different people, right? It's like the dev team's different than the art team, it's different than the design team, it's different than any of these things. And it's like some of them might have more cycles, some of them might have individuals that are more excited to implement specific technologies, right? And then it's their job to. It's like these kind of techs are like, as much as I'm fascinated about them, I rarely have an opportunity to try to push for them in the games that I work on, right? Because it's not my wheelhouse is art and art direction. So it's like what the game looks like, and I can push for it as much as I can in that, but it's like I can't implement them. I'm not going to want to be going typing in the code and implementing any of these rendering techs. So I have more power to ask for them than I ever did in the past. But at the same time, it's at the discretion of the development team, right? And that's the way a lot of these studios work. And then it gets even different when you're talking about, ports, because that port to PC can be done by a completely different team.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's being done by a different team, there might not be any communication. It's like I can tell you from my experience, even shipping Star Renegades, that the Switch port did 12 things visually that I'm not happy with, but I didn't have the power to change it.
You weren't in charge of it, yeah.
And it's like, despite doing like the vast majority of the art that went in that game. So it's like, I don't know what to say in that regard. It's like it's like a big ship, right? This game, any game, is like a big ship moving in a set direction, and you can steer it as much as you can. But sometimes there are people that'll be excited one way or another, DLSS, FSR, or any of this, and it's like, or they'll see an opportunity and they'll be like, "Oh, we can fit this in," and sometimes there's just no time for it. They wish there was more time.
So, I guess, to put a cap on the last part of like one of those things I just brought up, though, how much would you read into the fact that, because again, I don't think I've seen anyone else point this out. Everyone just goes, oh, well, AMD is getting adoption faster percentage wise. And I'm like, yes, but in the year FSR has been out, Nvidia's added more DLSS games than AMD's added FSR games. Would you read much into that, or do you think that's just the same thing, steering a ship, momentum?
No, that competition always pushes these kind of things, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, in Nvidia, I feel like this is a weird thing. I am really not a fan of the 1060. There's a lot of hardware from Nvidia that I am a fan of, so I'm not trying to badmouth them outwards. But 1060, in my opinion, was a pretty bad graphics card that performed in DirectX 11 as good as it ever was going to, and it was never going to age particularly well. And it was never going to be like a fine wine card. You're not going to play that in a Fuse and be like, this is a great card. It was always a card that was already doing everything it could do to just barely hold your games together. That was, but it sold like absolute crazy. And that's the type of stuff I don't like. And I feel like if Nvidia doesn't have competition, that's the kind of hardware that you get, or the software implementations you get. And then as soon as AMD actually gets on their toes and stands up in Nvidia's face, then they really push the boundaries. I mean, they might push the wattage too, which is a different conversation, but they'll push.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah. They push the boundaries of what these things are capable of. And it's like the most boring tech has ever been to me was when AMD was almost completely out and Intel had its complete CPU monopoly. Like it was just not very interesting, right? It's like shipping the same hardware over and over again with just enough to make sure that everyone was rebuying the new hardware without pushing new tech innovations. But the more that AMD has risen to both fight Intel and Nvidia, the more both of them have stepped up their game.
Well, so do you think RSR is just, I mean, it is just a logical thing to bring out as a complement, because you'll never be able to manually put support into every game. So just having that as an option with the driver level is nice. But I don't know. I think that a lot of it also is they want to make sure, as things start to come back in stock and are readily available, they want to make sure that there is that option for every game you play. But have you played around with RSR? Did you try it yet or anything like that?
I haven't had a chance to yet. My 5700 XT is in my daughter's computer, and I haven't been able to go up and play around to give that a go, but I'd be curious because that's at the Radeon driver level. So I think AMD we're talking to Valve about what they were doing with the Steam Deck and seeing it implemented at an OS level. And they're also seeing because I think that FSR was also implemented to Reshade, which is the PC plugin they pull into all sorts of games. It was implemented into emulators and all of this. And they're like, well, if everyone's doing the work of implementing this everywhere anyways, why don't we just give access to them at the driver level so that people don't have to set it in individual things, right? We have this version of it. And then they also were aware of the fact that they might have a branding conflict going forward, because at some point in time, FSR 1.0 is going to be RSR and RSR only, because FSR 2.0 is going to be their true competitor. So it feels like a split in branding. They're kind of moving FSR 1 to RSR, because and it's
Is there more general purpose, easy to implement? You can throw it on anything.
totally,
option.
and it's even to the point where it's in the driver, right? And if you need it implemented for all hardware, for Intel graphics, for Nvidia graphics, then you can implement it on the engine level. Otherwise, it's on the driver level, and then they can start differentiating between that and FSR, because then FSR is going to be their quality, right, for their actual competition against DLSS, and RSR is going to be just implementing a general purpose upscaler at the end of the pipeline.
Yeah, the thing is with RSR, but you haven't tested it, so we probably don't need to talk about it too much, is Dan is the co-host of the news episodes of Broken Silicon. He has a 6700 XT. I have a 3070. I haven't had a chance to try RSR yet, but he said it just basically didn't work in half the games he tried.
Yeah.
And when I went to the Reddit and the AMD subreddit and looked around, I also looked in the YouTube comments. Honestly, half of the people said it was amazing, and the other half of the people said broke my drivers or something.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You haven't tried it, so I don't know if you have that many thoughts. My thought just from that is it has to be, I think just AMD has to start pulling out the checkbook and paying to put this FSR in every game, like Nvidia is with DLSS, because RSR is just not going to work in some games randomly because it's at the driver level, and there's going to be weird bugs that pop up.
It's kind of a weird thing to say about AMD, because they're a company that is literally doing much better than it should, considering it's fighting two companies that are 10 times bigger than it. And, you know, it's amazing that they've held up as well as they have in the last 5 or 6 years, and that they've made the innovations that they've had. And the thing is that AMD is pretty much making all of its innovations uphill. And what I mean is, it's like virtually every bit of software that you run is done on the Intel compiler. We've never even really seen what Ryzen does when like software is perfectly tuned for it, right? It's like, we don't know what...
Besides the consoles, maybe. That's basically
well, even
it.
Still, a lot of those games are done with you. But it's like, you know, it's like a lot of these things, it's like the legacy of this tech. We've never seen it. So it's like, it's amazing that it's done as well as it has. And it's like, I mean, Intel really stepped up with 12th gen. So because they needed to, but because they were losing so much ground in the desktop space. But it's like, I don't know. It's like when you say pay out for all of these features, it's like, AMD's got to get in on the engine level with all of these things, where it's like literally for most devs just clicking a box earlier on in your game development, not troubleshooting at the end of the pipeline, at the end of shipping a game. If you like, I can tell you right now, it's like we're building a new game, you pull in the newest version of, let's say, Unreal or Unity, and when you're first building a game, it's like, oh, which screen space ambient occlusion do we want? There's like 5 checkboxes. You play around with it, right? It's like, you don't do that at the end of the game development. You're working on like the 50th stage of something. You're much less likely to implement that. When you're early and you're setting the tone and the visual direction, you're more likely to pull these techs and features in, from at least my standpoint, right? It's like, but once you're set in that, you're just trying to create a workflow to finish the rest of your game. A lot of the exploration for this kind of stuff happens early on. So if AMD wants a chance at any of this, they have to get in like basically every engine. They need to make sure that they're a checkbox in Unity, a checkbox in Unreal, in RE engine.
And yeah, you said that earlier in this episode's discussion as well, and I think that is an interesting point, that, well, FSR is easy to implement. It doesn't change the fact that they don't want to add something new at the end of a game, and getting in at the engine level might actually help FSR get more support, because they have to do it early in the design of a game.
Totally. If like, let's say they talk with Unreal, or like either through the relationship with PlayStation, Microsoft, and Unreal, and get it in there as a possible FSR 2.0 as a feature, then game devs will have the opportunity to test Unreal's TAA and test. They'll just click DLSS. They'll click FSR 2.0. They'll click that and they'll check the visual differences, and they'll determine which ones to include with their game. Right. And the earlier you get that in the engine tech, the more likely it's going to ship in lots of games. So I think that there's 2 things. I think that AMD's competition with Nvidia has pushed them to implement this into more games, like you were saying. And on top of that, the engines are getting more ready. So more games that will come out will support these techs, because these new technologies, because it's just already in. More game developers are coming at the part in the game development where they're seeing it more as a checkbox rather than something that might mess up their entire thing by the end of the development cycle.
So I think we agree then, and you know, look, we're going to need third-party testing in a few months, and we're going to have to see if it looks as good in every game as the presentations they put out, you know, as of this recording, portray FSR 2.0 as it will look. But it seems like we And I have no reason to doubt it, really. I will be impressed, though, but I think we both kind of expect FSR 2.0 to pretty much match the latest DLSS quality most of the time and pretty much equal it, right?
Yeah, that's my guess. I would like, to be honest, when you're looking at, I personally, when I look at RE Engine's temporal, when I look at Unreal Engine's
Mm.
temporal, when I look at like Ratchet and Clank, the latest release, whatever they're using at Insomniac, and when I look at DLSS, I'm like, it's so hard to count pixels. Like when you look at what Digital Foundry does to figure out what the resolution is, they need
Hmm.
they need the scene transitions. They're waiting for a scene transition to even know what the resolution is. They can only count the first frame of
Yeah.
every location. So it's like,
Well, yeah, I was blown away, and maybe you'll agree. Like in what is it, the Demon Souls remake in performance mode on the PS5, that technically the native res before they use their upscaling technology in that engine is 1440p, and I'm like, really, this looks sharper than some of these native 4K games I've seen on
well,
consoles or PC.
that might have been the example that I was using because I mentioned earlier too. It's like I played native 4K games that look worse than temporal scaled 1440p games, and maybe the Demon Souls up is probably the best example. Man, it's kind of weird because I'm
Well, so my question then is, where do you think FSR goes from here? Like, what's the next thing to improve? And same question for DLSS. Like, do you, and it's a thing I posited in the last Broken Silicon is, do you think eventually AMD starts adopting some form of machine learning to help with the algorithm in the back end or something eventually? And a reason it didn't do that right away is because that's like really esoteric, hard, complex. And FSR 1.0 was never going to use machine learning because you don't just add that to something. It takes a lot of time to plan it out. Like, do you think they eventually do start doing that?
Yeah, I have kind of like a weird thought to tie into the Intel Xe super sampling because I
Perfect.
thought it was kind of funny if let's say I know Intel's probably holding back their release, maybe not because the hardware is the trouble, but because they're really worried about sensitivity around drivers because they'll have forever living
Let
that
me
down.
jump in. I'm 99% sure that's what it is. And I keep saying that in my leaks about Alchemist. Like, I had pictures of Alchemist a year ago, so I've been following its development. When people say, I wonder when it's going to be produced, guys, it was produced a month ago. Like, they're already, I have the logs for production. I'm not going to go into more detail on what I have, but I literally know production weeks. It's being produced or it's already produced. There's warehouses somewhere holding these cards and the drivers aren't ready, is my understanding. And I think you're right. The software stack, like if they don't have an answer to half of this stuff, no one's going to buy it.
I thought it would be kind of funny if Intel Xe super sim. So AMD's problem is scale.
Hmm.
Nvidia has scale. Intel has scale, but Intel has no current, let's say, public-facing right to stand in the GPU space. So they have to earn the right to stand around with everyone else, right?
Hmm.
And their Xe super sampling is kind of interesting because Intel has the resources to train a really good,
Hmm.
like we were saying before, once you've built the training algorithm, once you've trained the AI, you can run it on anything. So their big advantage coming into this space is that they can get positive press by simply releasing a really good temporal upscaler with some machine learning upscaling, but opening it up to everyone. And then they get the good PR of being, and I think it would be funny if the only thing that win with when they come out the door is their upsampling.
Hmm.
I,
It's possible that might happen,
because they're the
especially with how long this is taking to come out.
well, yeah, and they have the resources to train it, right? It's like, and then, but they have no choice. They don't have the opportunity to make it proprietary. They don't have Nvidia's legs to stand on in releasing graphics hardware
Hmm.
right now. So they have to do an open equivalent to it. And AMD can benefit from that. Like it could be really funny if the Intel super sampling is XeSS is like essentially like 90% identical to DLSS, but works on everything. And then it would be
Hmm.
like, wow, thanks, Intel. Even if they don't succeed with their graphics cards, it'd be like, everyone would be like, good job, Intel. We love you right now. Like that would be a massive step up for them, having the best upscaling technology for free without any loyalties, forcing any loyalties any which way. And
And so you agree, though, it seems like with Alchemist, it's just the drivers and the software stack. Like I've heard its overclocking menu actually might be really good based on like, similar to the Intel Extreme tuner program for their CPUs. Like they might have all of that just built into the drivers for the GPU. But in terms of like, yeah, when it comes to the software for Alchemist, what I'm worried about is random stuff. Like, we take for granted the little things we have, like, oh, this is how I make a custom resolution, and I wondered that type of thing, and also I don't know if they have something like Shadow Play or Relive at all.
Yeah, capturing. Well, okay, I think if you look at XE, right? So they're obviously they're going to Alchemist, but with their like if you look at the Steam Deck versus the whatever Ionia versus the GDP Win, you know what, two of them are Radeon, one of them is running off of Intel's integrated graphics, or anyone who's bought a Surface or whatnot and tried to game on it, it's like 70% of the time it's good enough to game on, and then you'll come into weird issues where the game just doesn't boot, or there's some weird like draw order thing happening where textures are coming in front of other things that they're not supposed to, or things like that. So it's like,
Yeah, and it's not like indie games like Mountain Blade. I don't know. Actually, that's kind of a double A game now, Mountain Blade Bannerlord.
yeah.
But Halo Infinite, to my understanding, did not work when it came out. They had to the drivers to support it came out like a month later, and I'm like, not a good sign, man. What the heck?
And that's always been the problem with Intel's integrated graphics. And it's like their driver teams have never, it's like, people complain both. I will say I've flip-flopped between AMD and Nvidia graphics my entire life, and I've had bad drivers on both at various points in time. So I'm not talking like
Fermi made me never want to touch Nvidia again for years.
Fermi 600, right?
500 and 400.
500. I had the 680, the GeForce 680, and I had the driver installed that was bricking GPUs at that point in time. And I was like, why is my computer overheating?
I think it was the 700 series. I think the 700 series is when NVIDIA really got their drivers down. There's a rough patch there for like 4 years.
Yeah, and it's like, and I've had, I 5700 XT I had that card, and I didn't have too many issues with it, but there was occasional black screens and things like that I got. It wasn't that bad. But like, I've used integrated Intel on a laptop that I've had before, and it was by far the worst driver experience that I've had trying to run anything like that.
How recent was that? Because I had a Broadwell MacBook Air that I got like open box on eBay for a great deal, and back then that actually was like the strongest APU in that form factor, and for me the drivers worked great with Broadwell, but I think that was like a huge focus of Broadwell. I wouldn't be surprised if after that, and Broadwell would have been I don't know, 2000.
Broadwell's pre-Skylake, right?
Yeah, and right after Haswell, so it'd probably be like 2014, 2013 around there.
It was my Skylake laptop. It had a 1070 on it, and the 1070 died. And then it was going back to integrated graphics, and I still had to use it for 3 months before my work sent me another laptop. And that was the most painful experience I've ever had using a computer in my life, in terms of having to be in graphics engines and working on games and having to rely only on Intel graphics. So
yeah, I feel like something in their drivers fell apart after Haswell, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
Maybe the lack of competition, probably. I don't know.
They've been ramping up for this for a while because it's getting more and more necessary for the server space. I don't think they have the option to avoid graphics if they want to win contracts going forward. And that's what's ramping this all up, why the emphasis on hiring graphics. And it's like so much is done on FP compute, right? That if you don't have people building large graphics processors at you, you're just going to not win as many contracts, especially with Nvidia trying to get more ARM focused and having a complete solution themselves, right?
And AMD having Epic.
Well, AMD's had their complete
clobbering them.
Yeah, and Epic it's kind of interesting because it was like we were talking about hardware. It's like Intel, Wendell from Level 1 Talk was talking about this, but they had the traces for the 3D Vcache going back to like Rome, and they haven't been able to implement them for this entire time. So it's like building
Zen 3, literally the Zen 3D you're seeing, it's just literally the Zen 3 they've been making for a year and a half, and Zen 2 had prototypes that could support it. Although I believe the final silicon of Zen 2 did not support Vcache, but they have prototypes that did.
That was probably yield issues, or just waiting for TSMC to have everything up and running, or just not having.
It was the packaging.
Yeah.
This was when, based on what I was told, they can make the Vcache fine. Obviously, they can make Zen 3 fine. The problem was when they packaged it together, they were damaging like 80% of them or something, and they got down the process without having bad yields in that stage, is what I was told, at the end of 2020, which in CES, they just show it off right away.
Cache is super interesting because the latest IPC, I'll put IPC in quotes, gains that we've seen have been all cache related. So it's like Intel's 12th generation, the biggest difference between that and the 11th generation on their big cores is just having much more cache available. So it kind of turns out that like the weird thing is that now the means to speed up performance is getting rid of all of the little stalls in the pipeline, finding every little bottleneck and trying to minimize those as humanly possible. And I'm curious when we have the 5800 3D come out, how that can perform, because that's really all it's showing is bottleneck removal as a means to IPC. So every time that it would have to go to main memory, it now doesn't have to. And how much does that speed up your frame rate? I don't know. I think it's kind of fascinating. Like all of this, the technology. I mean, I don't know what Intel's graphics implementation is going to look like. I'm very curious. You probably have much more details on it than me. I don't know whether it's going to be more like a 3050 or a 3080, right? Or like
for Alchemist?
Yeah.
Do you mean in terms of design or performance?
Theoretical performance.
Oh, look, they've been targeting since late 2020. I mean, they wanted this to come out at the end of last year. It's hilarious. It's just still not out. But like, I mean, I had pictures since mid last year. So yeah, they wanted this to go. There's proof they wanted this out way sooner. But the target has always been 3070 Ti.
Yeah.
Before the 3070 Ti was even out, they were like, we want to get as close to the 3080 as we can. Think of it as a 3070 Ti. And there's a test where it performs that well. There's a test where it performs like a 3060. I think anyone that thinks this is going to be weaker than a 3060, it won't. But, it's how close they get to the 3070 Ti is the real question.
I think my question is more like, how close is it in silicon versus performance? And this kind of goes into our last conversation, because it's like, and I think the Steam Deck, playing around with that is interesting, because it's like RDNA 2 is fascinating, and it's fascinating how it behaves in different engines specifically. It's like playing some games and it's like, wow, it's like amazing. This hardware is absolutely fascinating. And you play it in other games and you're like, this is really underwhelming, right? But it's not necessarily...
We're going to run into that, I think, for sure with Alchemist, because I can't say the games that they've shown behind the scenes to some people, but let's say it was a game that really stuck out as a red flag, that they're like, look, we're, stronger than this card here. And without saying which series it is, it's like, it's not the latest edition. It's like 3 old, a game from 2014. Like, so it's not this one, but let's use this as an example. It's Assassin's Creed. They didn't show Valhalla. They didn't even show Odyssey. They showed Assassin's Creed 3 for some reason.
They have some really really
they're like, look, we beat the 3070.
Maybe it uses some specific shader effect that they have lots of beneficial performance, or it doesn't use any post-processing in a way that destroys frame rate. It'd be kind of funny.
And the contact I was talking to about this, we both agreed there just has to be something in the drivers doesn't work with this part of the new engine yet, or something. I don't know, like why on earth are you showing that off? And so I think we're going to see something I think this is and surprise, surprise, Raja Kadori's working on it. I think this is going to be like a Vega situation where at launch it's going to look underwhelming in some games, and then in other games, I did a comparison years ago, early in my channel's life, comparing the 2080 Ti to the Radeon 7, not because they were priced the same, but I'm like, these are technically their strongest cards. I wonder how close they are. And there were some games like Strange Brigade where the Radeon 7 could match a 2080 Ti if you overclocked it.
Even when when they implemented, I think, was it Wolfenstein 2? They implemented
that was a big game for Vega fanboys.
Oh man, if you pulled in, they added in once.
It used all of its features though. I'm not saying it's bad, but that was a game you could point to and say, look, it's stronger. It's almost as strong as a 1080 Ti or something.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting when you. So this is kind of the theoretical thing. We're talking about Intel Xe, right? So it's like the question is, and Nvidia enjoys being the baseline. So when people talk about them, they're never better or worse than themselves, right? It's like you take the 3070 as the 3070, and then in individual games, all of the other cards flip-flop. So it's like when it comes to Intel Xe, what is it going to be? Is it the fear is it match a 3070? It's like it could technically be in hardware equivalent to a 3080, and its best case scenario in performance and PC be a 3070, and its worst case be like a 3050. In terms of how it lies out. And that's where NVIDIA enjoys being the baseline, because in some games it gets to humiliate them. And other games it's like, oh, it does good in some games. And it's like,
And by the way, Intel struggled with that because Intel hates referencing competitors' products in slides.
And why
So
did it do that
Intel's
one slide deck presentation where it referenced Ryzen on every slide?
they're starting to give up on not referencing AMD, but there was a while there, if you'll remember, where like I don't know what they're doing with their CPUs, not comparing them to Ryzen, but like I've heard some marketing people over there struggling with like, do we say it's 10 times stronger than Tiger Lake? Do we say it's like you're gonna have to compare it to a 3070, man? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
like you
yeah.
can't compare it to Tiger Lake because that's
Your
your
integrated
strongest thing.
graphics. I'm gonna compare it to my old integrated graphics. Yeah, it's
Although I bet we do see a slide like that for sure. We will.
yeah. One then the question is what games, because this is going to be like no engines are optimizing for
Hmm.
this at that. So whatever Intel is doing, they're doing it at like a pure hardware to their driver to the engine. Like there's very little optimizations happening for this. So it's going to have to brute force its way to whatever position it's going to. And
Hmm.
that's it's a very hard place to come into this, which is why I was saying if there's any win they could have, it might be XeSS. If they come in and they give everyone essentially the keys to DLSS for free, then that's very interesting because, you know, Nvidia and
Well, and let me say, there's a reason they're probably launching the 128 execution unit model first, because that one's closest in performance to their current integrated graphics, and they think they can fix the drivers well enough for that one before they even bother to try to scale up optimizing for their graphics card that's going to be 10 times stronger than anything they've launched before.
yeah, and that's kind of, you know, it's kind of funny because I've heard people when I had students at my previous school that they were debating. So this is when I was teaching texturing and animation. They were debating over like Nvidia cards, and then they're bashing Radeon. And then I showed them
Hmm.
it was a GDC talk where Deus Ex Mankind Divided.
Hmm.
It's a 20-minute talk where they go through one frame, and
Yeah.
I'm like, do you see what's going on in like 16.6 milliseconds on your screen? It's like anybody doing this. This is nuts, right? It's like the way that hardware has come. It's amazing. Like we had all of these players in the 80s and 90s. You know, it's like Diamond, Viper, Voodoo. Like all of these companies
Hmm.
completely dropped off and aggregated to either Nvidia or like either Radeon or GeForce. That's all we've got left from that entire. I mean, Power VR went on to doing stuff for like integrated graphics and things like that, and other companies got bought out. But it's like, you know, it's gotten to be a crazy sophisticated game that very few people can even stand with, and Intel's trying to step into this full tilt. So
They have the resources to, and again, they have been making graphics for a very long time. They just haven't made them this big. So I think they can do it. But what you just said, it's funny. I was on like a small podcast last night, and I was asked, why aren't there more console makers? And I'm like, well, you go make one. It's hard.
oh yeah,
Like we're talking about juggernauts, decades of experience in the trenches from Nintendo, then Sony, now Microsoft. Stadia just got canceled. Google couldn't just jump in and do it. It's very hard to do this well. Since we just talked about Alchemist, I want to pivot to, I don't know how closely you've been following rumors, whether it's my own or just, there's been some stuff that I think is pretty accurate from some people with a decent track record of leaking stuff on Twitter. Like what do you think about the way AMD is going about RDNA 3 and the way Nvidia is going about Lovelace?
so this is I have been watching your, like I typically work. I've been really entrenched in work, so I'm not as up on this as I typically am.
Hmm.
And this is where you're going to get some more off the cuff reactions. Like I don't have any kind of outline of what
Hmm.
Lovelace and RDNA 3, like what their composition is going to be. And I'm very curious. Like if you had some kind of estimate of how many shaders, TMUs, and ROPs they would have.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I thought I was going to do an RDNA 3 leak first in like April and then follow that up with a Lovelace leak, but I had a decent amount of Lovelace info, and then Nvidia got hacked,
Oh
and I'm
yeah,
like, well, now I know this is all good info because it lines up
just
with
out.
what I had. And also, they just added the specs that I was missing for some of the parts.
Yeah.
So we basically know what Lovelace is, roughly speaking. But again, it's kind of like what we said earlier. We shouldn't just assume it works exactly the same way as Ampere. There's probably some tricks here and there in the architecture that just don't show up in drivers and that people testing or just don't know about. Because these companies, by the way, the more I'm learning of how crazy RDNA 3 is, like I literally think like AMD is like having some teams work on some IP blocks for like a part of the RDNA 3 design and making it interface with something that it's compatible with if it existed, but the thing that they're interfacing it with doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But it would be compatible with the real one another team's working on, so no one actually knows what the full picture looks like.
Until the end.
Yeah, and I would imagine, Lovely Nvidia does similar things, but what we know at the very least, and everything I've been told, is they're going to double performance. The original target was more like 75% more rasterization and maybe doubling ray tracing, but that was a 400 watt card. Now it looks like he'll use 500 or 600 watts.
How can anyone, as someone who's owned a 3090 and a Vega 64, it's like, those are some beasts to contend with, right? Like with just dealing with overall heat dissipation on a case. It's like I went through months of trying every fan configuration known, just push, pull, positive, negative air pressure, trying to see what worked best with all of these GPU configurations. And
I'm sorry, do you live in Canada?
I live in Canada.
Yeah, so you're not even like, it's not like you're in Florida.
No,
you can deal with a little heat,
But even still, it's like also, trying to get the most out of them, undervolting, overclocking for fun. But, like playing around with GPUs and stuff like that.
Look, and this is something I've been explaining over and over in a lot of recent videos I've been doing, like, because there were rumors coming out that Lovelace was going to use 850 watts, and I said, no.
Maybe on servers.
Yeah, and I'm like, it won't. Okay, guys. But the target was about a 75% increase with a 400 watt card for the 4090, and now it's universal. It's just so confirmed at this point. It's going to use more than 400 watts.
Are they on Samsung or are they on TSMC?
I think there's a chance they could actually be using TSMC's 4 nanometer.
Oh, it's going to be,
but at least 5.
TSMC is like, I think that oddly enough, as much as it was the worst decision for them technically to go to Samsung with the 3000 series, it was easily the best decision for them economically, because all of the contention around, like, everyone wants TSMC fab. Everyone, like, as soon as anyone drops off.
But they had to go with TSMC for Lovelace. Samsung just is too behind. 8 nanometer was barely able to keep up with 7 in density, certainly not clock speed and efficiency.
Oh, totally.
And now,
why would Lovelace be so hot though if it's on TSMC?
Right. So my understanding is they were going to kind of bump it up a tier was the original plan. So the 4090 was going to be a 400 to 450 watt card, but from their perspective, they're like they're about to launch a 450 watt 3090 Ti. Kind of. It's up for debate if it really exists. Honestly, like you're not going to be able to buy it, but I think that they then said, well, you know what? 350 watts worked. That we could keep the 3090 quiet, so we can get away with another 50 watts, can't we? And so that's what their target was. And they're just going to make the 4080 like 350, the 4070 like 280 watts. I don't think anyone really care about that anyways. But then my understanding is they just know RDNA 3 is a monster, and they're pulling out all the stops now. So what's the fastest RAM we can? Because you can't change designs. People think, why don't they just design a bigger chip? Because that takes years. They can't. All they can do is push clock speeds, and it's pretty universal now that you should expect it to be at least 450 watts for the top card.
I think the sentiment around RDNA 2 has really changed things for AMD. Both Zen plus RDNA. It's like, honestly, playing with the Steam Deck it's like a weird thing, because it's like it needed 2 more die shrinks from being a perfect device. But like playing Resident Evil 8 on that is like, what? It's like, this looks nuts, and it's running in a handheld in my hand. And when you see that you're like, RDNA 2.
And by the way, the Steam Deck's APU is from 2020. It was some discarded thing that was supposed to go into a Surface.
Well, I know, but even still.
That's what's so funny, too, is it could have been stronger. So it's actually, imagine if they actually launched it a year and a half ago, how impressive it would look.
So it's like, okay, as far as I'm concerned, RDNA 2, and RDNA 1 brought them up to Nvidia on IPC. RDNA 2, they're actually ahead on IPC and behind on shader count. And RDNA 3 is open, because we also can't discount AMD has they have more leverage than they've ever had. And they have more positive, and I'm not saying that like Nvidia has a lot of positive press, a lot of positive interactions, and AMD has more than they have ever had though. Microsoft works with them closely. Sony works with them closely. They develop, and
they like working with them, by the way.
Totally.
People love working with AMD, everyone I ask.
Yeah, and it's like, the custom silicon they've done for both of them, right? And on top of that, buying Xilinx, and what that means for the future, there's a lot of things that could be included on this roadmap. You know, there's a lot of things that could be integrated, and like I talked to you about this last time, but I think that Infinity Fabric is the biggest innovation AMD has pulled off, because it's just allowing them to put everything together, and it's a bottleneck they own. So if it starts going bad, they can just keep ramping it up. They can keep improving that core technology and just improving the way everything interfaces with each other. And then, anyways, they have like all of this, and then going into RDNA 3, it's like they could pull from so many of the innovations that they've done with Microsoft and with Sony.
And I think they are. Like, my understanding for RDNA 3 is, again, I think anytime people like see me leak something, they go like, what if AMD or Nvidia finds this out? And I'm like, guys, they know what each other are working on, totally. Generally speaking. They have whole teams trying to figure out what each other are working on. I'm just like one guy who doesn't have half of the abilities
like
or
in
connections.
The middle of that, like there's like shady group going between Nvidia and AMD, and you're just like watching them pass each other occasionally and getting a whisper, and it's like,
or it takes a very long time to like get a person you can actually talk to repeatedly, you know, at one of those companies, and like it's just one part of the company working on one project too. It's not like some engineer knows everything. I mean, not even the CEO knows everything they're working on off the top of their head, probably. So, I mean, but I think Nvidia's aware. You know, it's just so funny. About a year ago, and you know, AMD, the real people you talk to that work there, not the fake, you know, people, like they are honest, and they about RDNA 2, they said before it came out to me, like, hey, I don't think we're going to beat them at everything, but I think we're going to be pretty close to their top card. And I think we're going to lose ray tracing, but I think we're going to win efficiency, and I think we can even beat the 3080, probably not the 3090. And that's what happened. A year ago, the stuff I'm hearing about RDNA 3, which I've never heard AMD engineers talk like this, they're just like, we're going to win. So, like, that's how cocky they sounded a year ago. And it's because it's an MCM GPU, to my understanding, and it might use 3D stacking. And I really think they're going for something really big here that combines a couple of nodes. And I think Nvidia needs to push these giant dies as hard as they can, because they do not want to lose the crown. Even if they can only make 10 4090 Ti's that use 600 watts and no one can really buy them, they want something at the top of the chart at Tom's Hardware and Hardware Unboxed, or they're going to freak out because they just don't want to lose that mind share. Well, that's where the power usage comes from, I believe.
Well, I think the 3090 is even coming out of that, because the 3090 Ti, because Radeon, just the 6900 XT just took some of the Firestrike benchmarks for the first time from crazy overclockers. So it's like,
and they're about to launch the 6950 XT too.
So it's like, when you have, Nvidia hates that. They really don't like seeing that kind of hardware wins. So it's like, it's very, as someone who, so the issue with going MCM obviously is like, everyone gets, I had two 6970s in Crossfire, and before that I had two 48 70s times 2 or whatever they were, and those were like frame latency, so inconsistent frame pacing is always the fear. But I wonder with AMD's focus on,
it's recognized as one GPU.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious. Their work on the IO die, right? Like working with Zen,
or however they're doing it, right? I'm pretty sure there's some sort of an IO die, but it's still not. I'm just being honest. It's not abundantly clear to me, like, exactly how it works.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they kind of started this packaging revolution in chip design. They might not have, but like the first I caught onto this with Zen, right? Like having all of this and then having all of these chips kind of tethered together, and like the chiplets and all of that. And it's like with the IO die, they kind of went a step further. They pulled out all their IO onto a separate die, and it's like these kind of innovations and learning where to pull things onto a separate package and then how you can do them together could possibly solve issues like that, which is where they can start doing really, really potent designs that have an MCM approach, but without the downsides of trying to make everything, the latency between them and the timing between when everything happens perfectly in sync. Like they probably know exactly which aspects of it to pull out now to not have any of those issues. And this would be major innovations coming from, because now I know that they pulled some of their Zen team into the Radeon team and vice versa to really start innovating in this front. And this is where,
do you remember when that was announced? Wasn't that late last year when they announced that or something?
I think that it was announced I thought it was announced more around the 5700 XT era, the end of it.
Okay.
That,
you're right. Yeah.
that they were pulling because they didn't have the top end win there, and they were pulling more of the Zen design stuff into RDNA 2.
Yes, they said that in RDNA 2 Tech Talks that a lot of the Infinity cache came from pulling in some of the Zen design team, I think.
Yeah, and I they have so much they can pull off the table when it comes to RDNA 3. I'm really curious. I would love, but like I said before, AMD would have to win by 50% to even be noticed in a noticeable like section of the gaming public. They need answers to DLSS. They need answers. They need to be better at ray tracing. They need to win or match on their weakest fronts. They have to match Nvidia, and then they need to take advantage of the aggregation of tools.
The only thing I'll say about RDNA 3 latency is I think people underestimate what they've been able to do with the latest packaging. That yes, latency was an issue before, but especially if you just organize the architecture right, even in 2D, but especially in 3D, you can actually have cache closer to compute units in 3D than if it was on a monolithic die.
You think they're going to do stacking on RDNA 3?
We'll have to wait for the leak for that. I'm going to stop answering the questions around that, but what I will say is AMD will 100% do 3D stacking within about a year and a half. So yeah, it's coming. And there's a lot of, it's just which products, and not all of them will, like I think Navi 33 is a more traditional rendition of RDNA 3. You don't want everything to be this elaborate, crazy design. Monolithic's cheaper and sometimes just better for, depending on what you're doing with it. But I also agree though, here's the thing is, I think everyone keeps hearing, who actually knows people at AMD, that they're really cocky, that they're going to take the performance crown and rasterization, maybe even tie ray tracing or win that too. If that happens, though, based on what I'm seeing from Lovelace, though, I don't think AMD is going to win by 50%. I think what we're likely to see is Nvidia launch some 500 watt card that loses by 15%, 20% to a 375 400 watt AMD card. And so you'll have Nvidia, let's say 20% weaker, using 25% more energy. So that's a massive efficiency loss, really, in net sum. But you could see the argument where it might still just come down to software and marketing, because I saw someone in the YouTube comments say this, and I don't entirely disagree. Like, hey, look, if someone has a system that can support 400 watts, are they going to take a 10% haircut in performance and use 100 extra watts anyways to get NVIDIA? I think a lot of people will, unless, like you say, AMD just rushes in some aspect by 50% and has software that just hits it out of the park.
If AMD was what I dreamed them to be, they would pull the Tempest into everything. And if they were just schooling NVIDIA in audio across the board, right?
But they have before with like the 290X's engine, didn't they? And I don't think anyone really cared.
You're totally right. It was called, what was
no one cared, because you can't put that on a chart, so no one cares.
Thief used it, and there's a specific name for that tech. I can't remember the name, but
I think Battlefield 4 did too. Totally. There's a few games.
But I'm curious because they have to play NVIDIA's game from locking some aspect of it. But they can't be doing it just from a software perspective like NVIDIA does. They'd have to actually do it with a hardware feature that's interesting. And they'd have to have it already exist in the consoles in a way that was utilizable to just port it across so that devs would actually do it, because they're not going to do it. And this is like even...
And the first thing that comes to mind for you is audio, because they could do that.
Well, it's just because Tempest
easy to see
there,
the path
right?
of that.
It's like if they just put a similar block, like take one compute unit, do exactly what they did in the PS5 to it. It's like audio and PC is sometimes why I go with console over PC in games. That's a weird thing for me to say, but it's like there are games that I plug into my PC and getting the surround set up on it is a nightmare, but on console it works beautifully every time. And I really appreciate good audio and video. So it's like the other thing is getting your HDR settings right in Windows is another thing. It's like I was playing Elden Ring on both PS5 and on PC. And despite the fact that you can get a better experience on PC, it takes much longer to get there on your TV with speakers. I'm saying like getting it to match that experience from just like audio setup, getting your colors and contrast to match and everything is more work than I would like in that regard.
Than you want to do when you just want to sit down and play Elden Ring.
It was a bigger difference before with the like PS4, because it's like you're going from like
Oh yeah.
30 to 60 frames per second, and then you play on PC, you're like, oh,
And
this feels way better. But when you're playing a game, it's like, there's some of the games on PS5 I put on the 120 hertz mode, and I'm like, what? Like, there's no real reason to turn on your PC in that context, right? It's like you're sitting more comfortably on the couch in a different position. It's like there's advantages to all of these things, but
well, you're bringing up the consoles again, so this gives me a chance to segue into one of the final kind of blocks of questions I have here from the supporters on Patreon. Well, it's officially spring, which for me and my dog Reese means getting outside and growing some fresh food in our garden. And also, it means having to mow the lawn every week, having to take care of weeds, and just having to maintain the yard in general, which means that, yeah, during the spring and summer months, I like having a quick snack that I can make so I waste as little time as possible now that I'm spending more time taking care of my yard. But I also, of course, want it to be healthy and tasty, and, well, yeah, that's where Vite Ramen comes in. Vite Ramen is an American company that, just like me, likes using fresh ingredients to make meals tasty and healthy. And it only takes a few minutes to make, and they keep updating their recipe, like the V3 edition of beef pho recently, to keep ensuring their product is as good as it can be. So make sure, even if you bought them before, you check back at their store. And if you do, click on the link in the description and use the offer code BrokenSilicon to save 10% on a special bundle just for Moore's Law is Dead fans. That gives you $25 in free goodies, and it really does help support this channel tremendously. Seriously, I eat Vite Ramen. It's tasty, it's healthy, it's fresh, and it's especially reasonably priced if you use the Moore's Law is Dead deal. Try Vite Ramen today. So Kenahoon25 writes in and he says, hey, Tom and Bryan, I noticed more PS5 Pro and Xbox Series Z, he says that's what I'm calling the Series X refresh, coming out recently, and people are having a hard time accepting that it could beat the 6900 XT. When RDNA, so first of all, I don't know what recent leaks are coming out. What I will say is I did a leak last year where I'm 100% sure from talking to some people working on the consoles that they're at least playing with PS5 Pro designs and Xbox Series X designs. But what I will say is there's a lot of things, guys, that get designed that get shelved or something. That's the only thing. But they're definitely playing with it. I don't know what recent leaks there are, but I think I said last year too that there's no reason they couldn't bring out something as strong as the current flagships. But he says when RDNA 3 comes out, it looks like the 7600 XT will trade blows with the 6900 XT according to what you've been saying recently. And so what? That's late 2022. So then by 2023 or 2024, why is it so hard to believe a 6900 XT if it's already in a lower mid-range card this year? In 2 years could easily be in a console and be using 100 watts less. My question is, as a guy that owns a 6900 XT that eats 300 watts plus to game at 4K, do you think by that time a PS5 Pro or PS5 6 will come out that more people will switch to gaming consoles to save energy and money, since energy prices are going up so much right now? How much more performance do you really need if a PS6 can easily play games at native 4K 165, especially if only at around 100 to 150 watts? I think it would use more energy than that, even if I'm like 4 nanometer. But if I wasn't a content creator, I would definitely only game on my PS5 to save money. Thanks, you guys, for all the work that you do. I mean, I don't know about people switching or not. I think right now it's hard to say if anyone's switching to PC or console because nothing's in stock. So how do we even know? Like, everything sells out anyways, right?
In my personal circle, I did have several friends that ended up picking up a console instead of a PC just because
I did too,
it was in stock. And they were like, and it's like the like we were saying a second ago, the quality and experience is so much closer than it has been for at least the last 15 years right now. And when we're talking about the Pro model and whatnot, it's like, I don't know, I'm playing on I'm messing around with the Steam Deck, playing Elden Ring at 15 watts, and it's like, this scales like RDNA. I'm always most impressive with engines that scale and hardware that scales. When you can make it tiny and you can make it huge, and it does extremely well in both spaces. And they definitely have that with RDNA too. Like Vega scaled worse, right? Like scaling up architecture.
Yeah, Vega was actually pretty great in mobile. It's just once you scale it up, it was a disaster, so, at least in gaming efficiency.
Yeah, and they were kind of locked at 64 ROPS, so they could never, there was always one part of the pipeline that was hammered. But it's like, I don't know, it's like playing on this 512 shader RDNA 2, when you play like Resident Evil 8 on it, you're like, oh my gosh, this is like, feels closer to like PS5 in some games on the Steam Deck. Not all. It's an engine by engine basis, 100%. There are games that are completely underwhelming and games that are like, oh my goodness, this is remarkable. But at the same time, it's like when it comes to the PS5 Pro, then this is just a matter of die shrinking and logistics, right? It's like, is there availability at TSMC 5 nanometer or 4 nanometer, right? It's like they can
or 6 nanometer, because my understanding is Navi 33 is actually a monolithic 6 nanometer die, and that's what they're going to do. And so if you think about it, well, wait, yeah, if they make the 7600 XT basically a 128-bit 8 gigabyte 6900 XT, if I'm Sony and I see that card, I go, make it 256-bit, remove the Infinity Cache, PS5 Pro.
Well, they can't do that anymore because of the Tempest engine, because of those. Whatever they do,
there would have to be way more customizations than that. I massively oversimplified it, but you can see the path they take forward, where they can make a $600 device that's, you know, double the performance of the PS5 in a year from now, or 2 years from now.
But it's like, maybe. Is double enough? Like from the PS4 to PS4 Pro, we went, 2.5? It went 1.8 to 4 point something. The Xbox was a much bigger jump. It was 1.2 teraflops to 6, right? So it's like, the biggest win that they can do is an efficiency gain in ray tracing. That's easily the biggest thing they can do to validate a Pro model, is give you all of that settings at higher frame rates, because developers are already building those profiles in the games. They're building games with ray tracing features, but they are either doing it as a separate mode, like RE Village, or there's several games that have done it as a separate mode. Even Spider-Man, you can turn ray tracing off in almost all of these games. To be able to turn them on without sacrificing frame rate and a resolution would be huge wins. So they would need probably the efficiency of RDNA 3's shaders. They would need one die shrink, and they would, or at least 1 or 2 die shrinks, and they would need to probably, they might have to drop, no, they can't drop clocks. This is the big thing. Is I was thinking about this.
I think they just keep clocks the same on the die shrink, and they just like double compute units or something.
But they have to maintain such high clocks. Like that. This is the big question with the PS5.
Well, that's the thing. The PS5 really isn't clocked high for RDNA 2. You know, I've got the 6500 XT here that runs at 3 gigahertz.
I guess it's true. For a console, it's pretty high clocks, and even for an Nvidia card, that would be really high clocks. But
Nvidia uses the garbage node, so
the garbage node, one way to word it. So yeah, I mean, there's a path to it for sure. I think that right now, if they released it, some of it's just going to be PR, because
there's no way. And that's something I tried to explain last year in my league, is people freaked out. People freaked out about the PS5 Pro being a thing, and I'm like, guys, it's not coming out this year. I said in 2 years from now. What were you doing 2 years ago? Imagine yourself having that much more life lived, and then it comes out. I don't know if it'll feel that crazy.
Do you think the internet shortened the leak cycle? Because
for sure.
Because like, even I remember the early leaks for PS4 Pro and whatnot. People couldn't believe it because Sony had never done it before, right? And you know, there was these talks about it, but it was still like, it was only like a year off for the PS4 Pro from when I think I heard the first leaks. But this is like, the leaks are coming so early now that it's like, it does scare people about their current hardware. If it was the end of next year and people saw a PS5 Pro leak, they would be like, whatever, I paid this off 2 years ago, right? Or, you know, and then they don't feel guilty about it. And then they would just, but like right now, and like there are people clamoring like crazy to get PS5s or decent graphics cards or anything. So it's like all of these,
or even Switches some months. I mean, nothing's in stock.
You know, it's like you buy what you can, right? It's like, I know gamers that are like diehard Xbox or PlayStation fans, but they were in a store when the other one was in stock, and they're like, well, I guess I'm a PlayStation gamer now, or I'm, you know, like.
Well, they're very similar in performance too, so I think that's an easy sacrifice to make, unless, I don't know, you care about trophies or achievements or something.
Or your friends.
or if you have friends, right? Something you don't have to worry about. But I mean, I would say, I don't know why it's always a surprise. One of my first videos, which isn't up anymore because the quality was just horrible. It's like I was like hiking and talking into a phone. Is like my second video I made. Is before I figured out what I was even doing.
Yeah.
But I said, I don't know why people are doubting some of these rumors about like the PS5 and Xbox Series X. I'm like, they're going to be stronger than a 2080, and they're going to have SSDs because it's not coming out this year. And there were entire tech channels that just laughed off some of the leaks. And I'm like, whatever. I don't know why every generation people don't believe the moving target.
So this is your demographic, right? You're talking about, you're dealing with PC-centric people, left, right, and center, right? And then there's whatever the demographic is. I'm not meaning to call out a specific community. There's great things about all of these communities, but they're very narrow visioned on their specific thing. Their thing is the best. There's like an elitism that comes with, and especially I'm sure you and me probably had more of this when we were younger, like in our teens and whatnot, because you didn't have as much resources. So you would put all your money in one camp, and then you would feel you'd have to justify your opinion with everything around that. Right. And it's like, and to some extent, PCs become both more elitist and more, with streaming, it's like the only way to stream well is PC, right? And everyone watches streamers. So there's this extra component about being part of this community on top of that, where console gamers are a little alienated, right? Unless you're part of like the Smash community or something. But
I don't understand why they alienate each other. This is something I've talked ad nauseum with with a lot of guests is, I don't understand why if you listen to a podcast that's more console focused, they seem entirely inept when it comes to the hardware. And then if you listen to a PC thing, they focus on the PC so much they don't even really know what the specs of the consoles are. They're dissing.
Yeah, I don't know. I exist kind of in all of these spaces, and I like for me when I joke with my friends, I'm like, oh, which rectangle do you want me on? It's like, it doesn't make a difference. It's just like a square that plays games, and there's good games on everything. So there's means to justify wherever you're playing. It's like, I have 3 kids, so I probably logged in more Switch hours than virtually any other device, just due to, first of all, age appropriateness of content. Second of all, like, I don't know, like, I still love Zelda and Mario. Nothing's really changed in that regard, right? It's like, good games exist on all of these platforms, and there's reasons to turn all of them on. But it's like, the hardware aspect of it is like, I guess, just for more the hyper fascinated, the people that really want to know how these things work. It's like, I don't know how the Switch pulled off everything it did with 256 shaders, but it's like, and it
sold a lot of units. Some people figured it out. So Falto writes in, says, hello, with the release of the Steam Deck and it becoming and if it becomes very successful, do you think it could hold gaming back? Like we always talk about PS4, Xbox One being the lowest common denominator. What about the Steam Deck? I could see where now games have to at least run on a Steam Deck's level of performance too. Whereas if it didn't exist, maybe we'd push it farther. I don't think Steam Deck's going to be remotely close to the sales to be a lowest common denominator personally.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on how many years, because PC gamers are used to updating. If anyone can survive a 2-year life cycle, it would be the Steam Deck. Steam might feel the need to replace it more often with another piece of hardware called the same thing that becomes the newest long common denominator. And I can tell you from playing with the Steam Deck that it's probably going to be fine for the next 2 years. And this is like with engines being unfair to it, with it having a translation layer, with it, it's a remarkably impressive device for what it's currently doing. It's a little wider, it's a little louder than I would have liked. It's like, I'm curious. I think multi-platform is holding games back. And I think that Sony and Microsoft going multi-platform is like, I don't think Halo, I've enjoyed a lot of Halo Infinite, but I don't think it looks like it should have looked. And I think if they had just targeted...
Well, I think the Xbox One for sure held that one back.
Xbox One, PC, all of that. Like, it's like the split in development definitely holds hardware back. When it comes to like taking advantage of hardware, this is kind of, me and you talked about this last time, but it's like, I kind of fear Sony going more the multi-platform approach, because kind of the most beautiful and really interesting games that I remember historically are the ones that found that nook of art direction, that did weird things like Particles and Silent Hill 2 or Metal Gear Solid 2, or, deferred rendering in Killzone and Last of Us and Uncharted, and like God of War's GPU accelerated particles, and like all of these things in these games, they're really made things special. It's like when developers find their art direction and they push it to the corners of whatever a device is capable of, is usually where I find, and I'm not saying that other general purpose games don't have good art direction. I'm saying that like the leading charge in art direction, as far as I've been aware of most of my life, was always finding the nooks and crannies of hardware, the interesting features, the way it does things. Even going back to like weird like Mode 7 effects on Super Nintendo, or like blending, pixels. It's like those weird nooks in hardware have always made really interesting choices in art direction, and developers working within constraints, because it's like the less constrained developers get, the more that they aren't doing interesting things. But when they have like a really narrow fixation on a really strong aspect of hardware, there's a really cool marrying that happens in that space where you can do amazing things, right? And it's like, and then modern hardware doesn't even do it properly. It's like Silent Hill 2's fog is still messing up emulators and stuff to this day, right? Like same with, like there's weird things that are beautiful, like the beautiful little nooks of game development where you get like gems. Like I'm worried we're going to lose that space with this multi-platform
Well,
approach.
I mean, I think when you look at, you have to like take it on a case by case scenario. Like when it comes to the Sony ones, I think it's pretty clear that unless it's a third party or second party thing where they paid for, Forspoken to come to PS5 and don't focus on Xbox yet, like that type of thing, I think, yeah, everything you say applies. But I think like with Horizon or God of War coming to PC, it's like, well, I think they designed it for the PlayStation for God of War and didn't worry about PC at all.
Yeah.
And then they brought it to PC. I don't think you really lose any of that. And I think it depends on how the game was made multi-platform.
Totally. And you always get that like years down the line. I would say that the weirdest thing about the Steam Deck is it's the shortest gap that I've ever seen for a handheld version of games. Like literally playing Elden Ring on television and playing it portable. It's like I'm used to 5 to 6 years on that gap. Like going from Link to the Past.
I see what you mean. Like you get like a netbook and you're like, oh, I can play, I can finally play Battlefield 3 on this. Maybe not 5, but I can play 3 or something. Yeah, I don't know. I also don't. I just think that devs look at the market share too, and if I don't know what it's at, right? I think PS5's at like 16 million, Xbox is at like 9 million, 10 million. I don't know, somewhere around there. So they're gonna look at that and go, that's 26 million. So, or maybe almost 30 now. Who knows? And they go, yeah, we're gonna design our game for those. We're not gonna worry about the 1 million Steam Decks that are out there, but we're gonna optimize it later to work on it. It's just not the thing we're optimizing first when we're building the game. We'll figure it out later if we can make it work on there. That because I really think Sony can't get enough capacity to make PS5s. They're I don't know what, I think they're $250 billion company, somewhere around there. Valve's a $2 billion company. I don't think they bought a lot of capacity for the Steam Deck.
Well,
that's the thing I'd warn people.
Mind share, right? It's like there's mind share between, like Sony's got a really interesting, because I feel like they're having like an Nvidia moment. They have the mind share. People respect Sony. They respect PlayStation. They there is a vision of how their games are perceived that's very, I don't know, high end or something like that. And they're trying to pull everyone into that. They're trying to pull through media, getting more into movies, getting more into TV shows, getting like, how can we already have the reputation? How do we force everyone into our ecosystem? Valve has mind share because they obviously they've been.
I mean, they're ubiquitous with PC gaming.
They owned PC gaming, and they didn't even have anything close to a competitor until the Epic Game Store started giving a free game away every week. And like, that's the only thing that's contended with them, and having Fortnite be one of the biggest.
Yeah,
games.
I mean, it's funny when you look at things like Origin and Uplay and how they're like, well, if you want Battlefield 3, you're gonna have to use Origin or something, and then eventually they're like, never mind, you can buy Battlefield 2042 through Steam, we don't care anymore.
Well, a lot of, even Microsoft did that, right? And that's and they probably wouldn't have had to if they had Game Pass at that point in time. That's a different kind of train of thought, because Game Pass is also, like, all of my Xbox friends that have been playing Xboxes for years have all bought medium to high end PCs and continued being Xbox gamers. They just moved to their Game Pass account. It's like, that's Xbox opened up the doors for that. And a lot of my friends that were pretty deep in the Xbox ecosystem, they abandoned the Xbox ship without abandoning Xbox. And it's interesting that Microsoft set a path for them for that. But like,
well, they kind of had to, because they kind of alienated a lot of people, I think. This is my opinion with Xbox One. And the logical conclusion then is to take those people that left Xbox One, monetize them on PC and Xbox, because that's what you have to do. You know,
they lost their mind share, because the only thing that Xbox always had going for it was that it had the highest end console hardware every generation, and they lost that mind share with the One. And that was a hard thing for Xbox gamers, I think, more than anything, because it was like they were just used to that.
Well, and they were used to, I think, having a lot of like exclusives. Like there was that year where they bought Mass Effect, BioShock. I think there was a third one that was only on Xbox. They paid for those third-party
Yeah,
exclusives, and then something happened where all of a sudden they didn't.
it's true.
You know?
And then they didn't have any games to talk exclusively about, right? And it's like, and then we have kind of this weird world where the vast majority of games have gone completely open. There's like 10 to 20% of games that are closed in ecosystems, and then Nintendo just does whatever the heck it wants to do. And and that's fine because Nintendo is usually cheap enough that you can have whatever you want and buy Nintendo as well. But I don't know, like I don't think that if we're getting to the low end part of the conversation, I don't think the Steam Deck's going to hold anyone back for 2 years. It would hold them back past that point. But I'm just trying to answer that previous question.
If they force themselves to only that it has to run well on Steam Deck.
Well,
but I think the expectations are different too. It's like I can run at 30 frames though on Steam Deck and people accept it sometimes.
Well, and the other thing with Steam Deck is that we haven't seen any native ports, right? It's like everything's through the Proton layer. It's like at some point in time, developers could target more and then they wouldn't be losing the somewhere between 20 and 40% of performance that they're losing by just doing it through all of these secondary layers, Proton and Steam OS. If you had a native port, you wouldn't lose as much hardware. So there's still potential there. Like it's not weak hardware per se, especially at the resolution it's running at. So I'm curious.
Well, let me ask you this. Alexander writes in, he says, "Hi, Bryan. I'm curious if your team is talking about or planning to optimize for the Steam Deck at all."
I don't know if I can answer that. Okay. NDA based stuff. Like I don't want to speak in behalf of anything that get me in trouble. Okay, let me answer it generally instead of any way that could affect NDA in this kind of framework. The biggest thing developers are concerned about in regards to Steam is whether they're going to be put on the front page. Because that difference between whether your game gets listed on the front cover, because you have no choice.
You're right. That is a huge pull they could have, though, to start pushing that.
That's the only thing that game devs are, because if you release a game on Steam and Steam never cycles it to the front image, you're going to get virtually no sales. Fortunately, both Star Renegades and Halcyon 6, Steam put it in its front run for the week that it came out. So it was one of the cycling images, which is the primary reasons that they sold as well as they did.
I've heard similar things about the PlayStation Store. Like indie developers get pissed that they release a game and for some reason they were like not on the front page and some much cheaper game was. And if they don't get on the front page for the first week, it kind of kills them for a while.
Whether you're in a Nintendo Direct, whether Nintendo puts you in there, these are the areas that indie developers have very little power, and it's the biggest concerns. So if you were saying if Steam went to a bunch of games that looked like they were going to be good, or a bunch of developers that have a track record of releasing even mediocre to good games, and said, hey, we can promise you front page window this time of your launch unless you shift massively delayed on it, then if you could work on maybe doing a Steam Deck port and we can guarantee front on the Steam Deck, devs would be interested in that, but it has to be incentivized for them, right? They need to have the trust to actually to do that because they don't want to put in the extra. Okay, like I think we touched on this. No, I didn't touch on it with you.
But no, I want to be very clear that you are changing my mind a little bit because I just disregard the Steam Deck when it comes to lowest common denominators. I don't think people are going to worry about it. I think they're going to worry about the 80 million desktops and 100 million PlayStations and Xboxes people game on before they worry about 2 million Steam Decks. But you're right. Some studios may use it as the lowest common denominator if they know it runs perfectly and they can get on the front page of Steam because that'll help all of their sales.
It will. And that's where Steam has the mind share. If Steam's going to offer that, I don't know if they have. And I don't know whether they feel it's ethical to do so. That's something that it's another question entirely. But if you're talking purely financial means on it, that's where my mind goes. It's like, that's what devs are scared. And are devs willing to take a risk to implement I can tell you from the forefront as a talking to a lot of developers who have done Linux ports, that it was some of the worst experiences they had in stretching their resources and getting very little payback, right? Whether or not they were great ports or not, I don't want to get into that specific nature of it. But there was a lot of cry for it. But when they released it, it didn't end up amounting to enough to have made it, at least in their minds, worth their time, right? And I don't think the Steam Deck is that kind of picture. I think that there's the risk of it being that kind of picture, just like a complete afterthought, which is why Valve has gone to such an extreme length from the beginning to make the like basically Valve's been treating this as we're just going nuts on Proton, trying to make this as little bit of.
Well, I think that's why it's worth their time, right? Even if they only sell 5 million total over a few years. And I think that would be considered a huge success, by the way, for the budget of this project. But it's allowing them to make Linux. This is a Trojan horse to make Linux good at gaming.
Well, that's the surprising thing, is it's like, I don't know, I've talked before about Linux specifically, and the biggest issue I think Linux has had is that artists haven't been pulled into the ecosystem to make any of the processes make sense. Because like, I don't know, I work with tools built by the developers all the time. And it's not typically until, and it's not that they aren't genius tools, but it's not until artists and other people play around with them and see all of the ways that they're just not intuitive from a person interacting on the outside perspective, that these things get fixed, which has kind of been the black hole of Linux for too long, right? Like you go in and then there's all of these weird things and you're like, oh, what do I have to do? I have to go in and change this in this file. I have to do this. It's like that kind of stuff is beyond most users. You need to have pulled artists and other people into the ecosystem to start creating more streamlined, easy interfaces for these things to solve some of these problems. And SteamOS is solving some of those to some extent. It's actually amazing how much worse the experience is if you transition a Steam Deck to Windows versus just running it with SteamOS. But what you're losing right now is game compatibility, although almost everything I've played has run okay. But I guess it really depends. Like some games won't, right? So it's like you're relying on this.
I've heard that's a rapidly improving situation too. Like the pre-release, they had way more games have issues, and they're trying to make. Now that hundreds of thousands of people have a Steam Deck, they have the input to check everything at once and patch it. Well, actually, right. So Brett Summers writes in. He says, "Hey Tom and Brian. Brian, congrats on your promotion. Your episode with Tom inspired me to take courses for game design and computer science. A passion of my life since I could remember, just never acted on it. So thank you. But anyways, my question is this: from an art direction perspective, do you make assets any differently with FSR, DLSS, or maybe in the future XE super sampling in mind? At the end result may vary from what was originally intended, or is it something you just make the asset, and if an upscaling technique is used, you just let it do what it's got to do, and whatever artifacts appear, whatever." Bonus question, if you can answer this: do these upscaling techniques have an effect on a studio when they're in a planning stage for what might end up as a recommended system spec? Example, RX 5700 might not give a stable 1440p 60 without the aid of upscaling, but then do you recommend it for 1440p now that you know that FSR is a thing?
Okay, so there's like 3 questions there. I'll try to pick out each individual one. So in regards to art direction on assets, it doesn't affect there's no chance from my perspective that it would affect the individual asset generation. Where the part in the pipeline that I engage in regularly is like, I would say, the beautification process. So there's the point where you're putting everything together in a scene, you're adjusting all of your post-processing, your color grading, your ambient occlusion, your shadows, how all of those things play out and how it marries together in a screen and comes together on an image. At that point in time is where these factors might come into play. You might be playing around with those and be like, how does this look after the scaling is concluded? Versus you're not going to do it when you're making a 3D mesh and doing your textures and normals and like your entire PBR pipeline, or when it's all of that is going to be 100% in the end of an image setup. When it's going to affect post-processing more than anything. I would say that there'll be the big risk is having to adjust post-processing settings. So that's where I would imagine me doing it. I haven't had the chance personally. These conversations go on in my head, and I now that I have this rendering tech that I talk to regularly, I do poke them about this. But the other thing is about your other question. I'm just trying to remember exactly how it was worded, but
well, I guess the other part of it is, do you look at DLSS and go, oh, well, now we know because of DLSS and FSR that
lowers the spec for minimum specifications.
2060 is performing like a whatever, and so now we can target this level of assets.
I think that part of it goes to something I said in our last talk, where it's like you make games and then you always kind of overshoot. And you hope that either new hardware or new innovations in technology compensate for some of your overshooting. And that's kind of where that comes into play. I mean, it's great that a wider, especially with higher graphics features, because a lot of devs are worried about their low settings in games, and they might be a little bit more aggressive knowing that these FSR and DLSS exist with their low settings. They might up them.
But here's the thing, right? The problem is those low settings are usually built for people running. I mean, honestly, half the time still GTX 560s, and
I know.
like I don't know, like what's another one? I mean, a lot of 480s and 580s, and FSR isn't. I guess you could put that in your game and say that works on Polaris, and that may actually it would work on a GTX 560 as
would.
well. But DLSS only works on the latest stuff anyways, and I think there is a worry that the low settings are meant for things that might not even run. I mean, RSR just came out too,
Yeah.
like
I think that you're finding that people are forgiving if they have the hardware with the features. They're a little bit more forgiving if the settings are murdering their computer because they have a path to having the graphic settings that they want, and there's good things that happen there. And like I was saying, it's going to affect specific spec levels. So it's more likely that you might push the low or the medium up a little bit, especially if you're implementing FSR and everyone can do it and it's a feature there in your game, right? Then you might be a little bit. I wouldn't say you're going to make your assets way better, but you might push them up 10 or 20%, knowing that if worst case scenario, someone complains in your Discord server or on the Steam thing, your comment can be, if you turn on FSR and set it to this setting, you can get around that, right? It's like you have a path to kind of alleviate the situation, because a lot of times devs are forced to react to individual gamers in those situations.
mm-hmm.
And they want to, like most well-meaning devs they want to help the gamer. They want to have the ability to, and tech like that does kind of open a path to be like, hey, if you try this, maybe it'd be a bit better for you. You get a better frame rate out of it. So I think it does alleviate some of that, but I wouldn't say it's affected things until, I think we talked about this last time, but it's like, I think most devs are hoping everyone gets up to a 3060, 6700 XT. If everyone moved to their hardware, if we just deleted all hardware before that point in time, game devs would be so happy. They'd just be like,
oh my God, it makes such a difference in what you could do.
2060, 2070. If somewhere like
I had a dev at Ubisoft tell me that he just wishes the base, the minimum was a 2060. That's what he said.
If you just deleted every GPU before that, it was like devs would be so freed up. They'd be like, oh, we know what hardware features are available. We know you're not running on some weird integrated computer. PCs are so strange because you can kind of jerry rig them, right? Like in so many ways. You can have like an ancient CPU and a high-end GPU, and you can have the inverse. You can have an ancient GPU and a high-end CPU, and you're like, well, I can run. That's the worst, a high-end CPU and a low-end GPU, because you can I can run all of my processing software fine.
I can run this game at 400 frames, 360p.
Yeah, exactly. It's like there's really weird things like that happen, and I mean, devs are really sensitive. I think that most devs are in a positive way sensitive to the bad feedback. So what they're always trying to do is, when it comes to low specs, they want it to include as many gamers as possible. And I don't think that we're going to get the results we want until everyone if they give us that world. If they give us a world where the 2060, 3060 was the minimum spec, game devs would be a whole lot less anxious about their projects. But
this kind of leads into a couple questions here. I think it would be a good way to wind this down. Matthew Landavazo writes, and he says, hi, Bryan. In your experience as an art director and being responsible for the final look of a game, do you think PC gamers maybe have too many choices in upscaling techniques and other visual features? To be more specific, it must be hard for a less informed PC gamer to know all of what's available to them and the visual trade-offs of each and ultimately land on optimal settings. Do you think consoles have an advantage in presenting the game as exactly you envisioned it? And do you think PC developers would benefit from a less is more visual settings menu?
Yeah, and there's also like, really depends on the size of the devs. Like, I'm sure it's not a problem with like Red Dead Redemption 2. Small devs don't even have the ability to test all their high-end settings. They might just they might make the game for medium or something like that, and then their high-end, like whatever, let's say it's their volumetric lighting, they'll just change to like a half res volumetric lighting setting to like full res or like
super
double
sampling
res,
and stuff,
and they'll just do that, and then they'll let PC gamers deal with that. But then it's like, it might not even be perceivable. It's like a good example of that is the Nier Automata port to PC used really high-end volumetric lights that were imperceivable, and when people made modifications to it and just dropped them down, it looked identical, but everyone's performance was so much better on their PCs. So it's like there's weird use cases where specifically when it comes to art direction, I'm just trying to remember the exact nature of the question. It's like, I personally find it easier to game on PC because I have two sides to myself. I'm a tinkerer and
Hmm.
I'm more likely to just take a game at face value and go through it on console. If I play a game on PC, I'm going into menus all the time and tweaking settings and seeing what they do. It
Hmm.
like engages a completely different part of me.
Well, yeah, because we find it fun. I wouldn't want to remove that. I guess he's just saying. I guess like in a console game. Well, actually, here's an interesting way to point out an aspect of this conversation. Like the problem of multiplayer games and like trying to make it so you can have more particles and foliage, but that obfuscates if you can snipe someone in the distance
Oh
sometimes. And
yeah.
I think that's always a major issue of like the disparity. And you don't even know, did they download some like, you know, what is it, like Minecraft looking texture or Mario 64 looking texture pack so everything sticks out?
So
Like
I
that's a major worry, I think, if you're a PC
I have
developer.
kind of like a funny story on that because it's like as an art director, I cringe like crazy at some of those changes. But my brother was
Hmm.
growing up ludicrously good at video games. Or he won one of the Toronto-based Unreal
Mm.
tournaments. He has a medal from winning it. He was a crazy Quake player. He is a funny story because he won one of the Red Alert tournaments, but he had gotten banned as his regular username. So Westwood came to the door with like a high-end video card or sound card at the time. But my sister won it because he had to register her name because he got banned as
Oh.
himself. And there's just like funny things like that. But he did really funny modifications to games. So I remember Quake 3, he had all the textures off. It looked
Hmm.
crazy. In Quake 2, he modded all of the sound effects. He took all of the wave files and replaced them with his own voice saying exactly where they were. So when you came out of the water in the level, it would say out of water. And when you picked up the railgun, it'd be like railgun instead of like just making a little dinky
Yeah, the
sound.
pickup sound effect of that gun is just he picked up the railgun, so now I know he's over
So he
there.
could own
You
the
could
maps.
you could even do, yeah, you could do effects where the different audio files for them walking in a distance could be 20 feet away, 20 feet away, 20 feet away. Like I could see you making that file. That's
Yeah.
hilarious.
So it's like, and then I grew up from a completely like, so anyways, that I saw that in the house and that always drove me crazy because I'd do the opposite. I'd push the games that I played to
Hmm.
like the lowest frame rate possible just to see everything and that's the artist in me that I was trying to see what the intention
Yeah.
was behind this project. But I completely understand the nature of why someone would downgrade the settings for an advantage in that. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, I mean, latency is huge for just being able to react in time. So it's like there's an incentive to turning down graphics in virtually all of these games. And this is where different teams at game studios, because I think it's important to not think of games as monoliths, right? It's like different teams doing everything. It's like the design team is typically really intent on what it feels like to play, right? The dev team is trying to make all the tools and stuff in place for it to work properly or how things are implemented. And the art team is trying to make sure that the onlookers, even if you ruin your game, are walking by and seeing your game presented in a very specific light, and that you can feel proud of it. That you're not going to have, like there's different people with different intentions in all of these aspects of a game, and I think it's important to actually to think about that because you know if it was up to me, it was like I don't think I would want people doing what my brother did to these games, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, but I understand it because at least I saw it growing up. I can see why someone would have a competitive advantage by modifying games for these kind of things. And
I'm gonna tell my brother and a few people about that because that is hilarious. I've never thought of doing that, but it's like, why could you not? You could just like the sound effect of the feet being 20 feet away. You could just could tell you where he
yeah,
is.
totally. So it's like those are, like those are funny things. And that was before aimbots and all of those other things, right? So it was like they couldn't hack the game in other ways, but you had to have the skill. But anyways, seeing there's 5 funny stories I could say just about that, but it's like yeah, I don't know. When it comes to art direction, it's like I care most about what a game looks like. That's what I care about. When I'm making a game, I'm going in, I'm adjusting ambient occlusion like crazy, tweaking it, loading it. When I put it out there, it's like then the worst thing is that I have to work with different monitor ranges because sometimes I'll do something that looks really good on a color correct
Oh,
monitor, and then one of my coworkers will have like a
I have to
crazy
deal with that too.
they'll have a
Yeah.
crazy saturated monitor and they'll look crazy on theirs, and then I have to try to neutralize to find the middle ground between the average range of devices and what my intent was.
Yeah, I have 3 different monitors when I'm editing a video. Like I've moved like the file around while I'm editing, and I'm like, that's not the shade of green I want it to look
Oh,
like on
totally.
someone's monitor.
If
You know?
the odd thing too is if you have different monitors that require different color profiles, even if you screen capture the picture on that
Mm-hmm.
monitor with that color profile and you pull it into different monitors, it will represent differently. Even it like it's so weird. And then whether if you just dragged it into the other monitor and captured a picture of it, just like Windows Shift S and whatever, and drag it onto another screen, it'll look different depending on which monitor you capture it on. And it's like little things like that are so impossible to track from and it's like you're trying to do this kind of, you might have a robust vision, but you have to neutralize it as much as you can to deal with a wide range of everything from hardware to like their graphics, or sorry, your monitors, and all of these aspects of game development.
All right. Well, we've been talking for over 2 hours here. As usual, I thought we would talk for a very long time. I've gone through, I think, most of the important points. I think we organically went through just about every subject I wanted to touch on. And I know that our audio engineer has to get honestly editing this pretty soon. But is there any final things you wanted to discuss or say? Because I know you are a thoughtful person. It's obvious. You put thought into this before you come on. Like, is there anything we missed that you just want to add quick?
No.
And you can say no.
Well, I mean, I do want to say a couple of things before we wrap up. I really appreciate this podcast. I apologize if I offended any individual person. I did not intend to offend any group or whatnot. I love talking like this. I think one thing that I wanted to say is, hey, AMD tech, Nvidia tech, Intel tech, if you want to reach out to me, send me a message. If you want me to make a silly GIF for you on Twitter, I might do that too. It's like, these are fun things. I love interacting with these. I feel like there's too much in this space, in game development and art direction and PC space. Everyone's interacting with the same things and we're not talking enough. There's like everything is an island of communication, and then it's like we're missing all of the interlinking between the island of communication. And my goal is kind of what I've really loved about your podcast doing this is like Broken Silicon is one of my favorite things about what you do. Just seeing conversations like this, seeing level 1 tech move in that direction, see these things. Like I'm appreciating this. I'm in this weird stance where it's like, I would love to do more of these conversations and do this myself, but I care about art too much and I don't have time to edit anything. So it's like, I'm in this weird thing where it's like, for me, it's like, am I going to edit a video or am I going to draw something? And I'm much more likely to draw something. So it's like, if anyone wants to talk to me, I'm happy to talk to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work. When people ask me, have you considered starting another podcast? It's like, I had a couple other ones. I just canceled them. It's like, yeah, I'd be a co-host, but I can't manage another. It's way too much work. But I mean, what I will say is, I mean, you've been on twice. We're certainly happy to have you on all the time because you're one of the rare people that I think interfaces with everything that we talk about. You actually play games. You don't just benchmark them. You actually know how the games are made, and you actually know a lot about the hardware that makes them, and in a multi-dimensional way, not just like, I'm just worried about frame latency in this code I'm writing. Like, that's all some people I talk to, like Sony or something, or like Obsidian or something. Like, he doesn't actually care that much about the hardware. He just knows what the hardware he has. He's got to get it to offer more frames in that one scene.
Yeah.
But you seem to interface with all of it. And so it's usually, I think, very illuminating every time you come on. So you're certainly going to be invited on again if you want to come on.
Yeah, for sure. For me, it's like, I think it's that I interoperate between teams, right? I have to talk to tech dev teams. I'm not amazing. I'm not going to say that I'm like an amazing whatever, but I feel like if I have a superpower in terms of like how I interact with my friends and stuff, it's that I've been able to communicate tech in a way that a lot of people who are deep into tech just can't. And it goes over their head. And I don't like, and that's just my personal group of friends. Maybe it's not true online or whatnot, but it's like almost all of my friends that care that they were buying a TV, if they're buying a computer, they want to hear my insight. They want to understand like what's going on with these new consoles. It's like around when new consoles are coming, I'll get like 10 phone calls like, hey, what's going on with this?
Is the PS5 10 times stronger because of its SSD? And of course you say, yes, of course it is.
I'll be like, well, it is on this. This is what this opens up in games. Here's a video example that shows exactly, it's like streamlining these kind of conversations. So it's like, maybe I'll talk to my render tech and maybe me and him and you can do a podcast at some point in time. But it's that could be kind of interesting. There's more specific examples.
Oh, for sure. I'd love to. He's certainly invited on. I'm trying. And he's specifically invited on too because it's like, I don't know why more people don't talk to the people actually making the game.
Yeah.
It's just all marketing people or the guy who wrote the story, which those, I get why the marketing guys everywhere, and I get why people want to talk to, I don't know, Neil Druckmann or something.
I think
I get it, but
if you get too big of a team, though, then there's fear, right? Is like you don't want to say anything that looks bad to your team. And I want to say my game studio that I work for is amazing and I love them. So I don't want to say anything bad about them. But it's like, you don't want to, that's the risk, right? It's probably why it's hard to get some people on. And I can see why there'd be a hesitancy, especially with sensitivity.
That is their
materials.
worry, whether it's an Xbox or a PlayStation dev. They're like very much so. It's not even about they're worried about an NDA. They just don't want to do anything that could accidentally affect the work of other people.
Totally. And it's like,
that's what it's a non-selfish thing.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that like I just love games. Games are amazing things, and they're, it's like being so deep in game development has demystified them to some extent. Like knowing exactly, everyone sees shadow cascades, right, in games where it's like, oh, this is where your shadows get worse. But knowing at which points and which distances everything just goes to complete nothingness, it's like it does change how you perceive games to some extent, right? It's like the more you play around behind the scenes, knowing that, hey, at this point, shadows even disappear. It's like, you want to complain about shadow cascades, they're not even existing when they're that far away.
Oh, yeah. And like talking to a lot of developers and people who actually program these, like recently we were playing Elden Ring, and for some reason we moved a lever in a dungeon playing co-op with my brother. Then I think my brother one of us got lagged out, or he had to reset it. And then when we came back, the lever was moved on the co-op people's screens, but not on my brother's screen. So then we're like, we didn't know what to do. So we're like, well, I hope this isn't screwed. But I'm like, why would that save it in the instance? And then we restarted the PS5, and then it was reset. And I'm like, oh, so there must be something in the cache that stored that we moved the lever, but didn't show up on your screen. And you had to reset the entire dungeon for it to move.
I can give you a little bit of context on that specifically. So Star Renegades it was like a roguelike saving system. So it was trying to always save. And when we were going through Nintendo's their screening process for the game, they told us off for saving too often. And they made us, because all of the writes, they're like, you're writing way too much. So, you have to reduce the amount of writes. So we had to change how often it's saved, just to make sure. So it's like things like that happen, and sometimes it might not even be FromSoft. It could be whatever, like they face this, and then it might be something they did on PS5, and then they port that over to
but
PC.
Not on another one.
It's like it could be something like that, because they're just forced, oh, we can only save this much. We don't want too many writes in this way. We don't want, it's like there's all of these approval processes.
Or like it saves to the host world constantly, or at a different rate that it's saving things that happen to the co-op world, and not. If
you're wondering why Halo Infinite's co-op campaign mode isn't out yet, that would probably be why, right? Like,
oh really? Because that is something I worried about.
This is a guess
that's something I wondered, I should say. Like it doesn't make like, because the co-op's in the menu. It's hilarious. It's just like number of players in a room when you're starting single player. I'm like, well, one, you don't have co-op, and it's like clearly they built it for co-op, and they just walled it off in the menu.
Well,
barely.
They might have faced some like really egregious bugs or edge case scenarios, right? Like there's lots of times that ends up happening, where it's like you go through the testing phase and you're like, ooh, yeah, even if it works well 80% of the time, and then 20% of the time it screws over gamers dramatically, that's a dangerous place to be in for shipping your game, right? So it's like you got to be very careful. And what's like, even look at Elden Ring. It's like critically acclaimed like crazy, but due to its technical issues on PC, it has like a huge array of negative reviews. And it's not due to the quality of the game. It's like just purely technical issues. So it's like, there's a lot of sensitivity in the game development space around these kind of things, because, and to some extent, like Microsoft was probably laying the cards, and they're like, well, if we release a campaign that works and is functional, and we release multiplayer and it's functional, it's like, you got to watch all of this stuff with game development, because it's like, it's so hard, right? And synchronizing between like multiplayer, and I'll tell you, like there's a lot of different middleware solutions developers can pull in for synchronizing between players. They all have drawbacks. They have player limits. You can see that, like, if you ever get into game development, you'd be like, oh, if you're whatever, a Unity developer, and you're assessing Proton versus there's several, and you can test them. You test latency. You can be like, oh, how many enemies can I have on screen? Because they can limit how many enemies you have on screen. And it's like, oh, is it tracking everyone? Is one character going out of sync, right? It's like all of this kind of stuff happens, and you're like, I don't know. It's like, co-op multiplayer is not the easiest thing to manage a lot of the time. So
Honestly, what you're making me realize again, though, is it'll be easy to find subjects to to bring you on for, because I didn't even intend, but you can actually answer some of these questions. You can go, no, I think I know what happened.
yeah,
You know,
well, it's like you just assess it, right? You look at it, you look at your experience, and then you kind of guess. Like it's kind of interesting because it's like I'm having this kind of conversation with you, and it's like I could go just as deep into art or other things, and it's like,
Mhm.
and that's all my different wheelhouses. But I love these kind of conversations, which is why I'm very thankful you had me on again. And
Oh yeah, and then let's do this. Plug your studio, or like, do you have any plugs? You should
oh
plug.
yeah,
I mean, your LinkedIn or your Twitter will be in the description if people want to reach out to you. But like, I assume you want to promote the games you work on.
yeah, totally. If you feel like it, you just go on Steam. Like if you go to Massive Damage Games on Steam, they have Halcyon 6 and Star Renegades, we're working on something new that's really special, I feel, but I can't talk about that at all. That's all under NDA. And it's completely using kind of more modern tech and everything. So anyways, that's really interesting from my standpoint. You can always follow me on Twitter. I started my Instagram way late, so I have almost no followers. I've done a lot of like pretty successful gifts on Twitter, so I have a decent following on there. You can always message me. You can go to my website. I'm sure Tom will link that.
That'll all be in the description.
If you want to chat with me on a podcast, then I'm happy to chat with anyone who's got interesting subject matter. I don't have time to edit anything. I'll probably throw it on YouTube, but it doesn't guarantee anything with me, which is why I really appreciate people like Tom who have, your whole channel, Moore's Law is Dead, and Broken Silicon, for giving opportunities and taking the time, because I know the last conversation we have, we went for 3 some hours and it ended up being a 2.5 hour video, and you edited out the perfect things. Because I'm like, oh, I look stupid there. You edited that out. Thank you so much.
Oh, and a lot of, sometimes we didn't do that with that episode, but sometimes we even take the parts we edit out, re-put them together, and make them loop like it's one coherent conversation, and then just release it as like a B cut for Die Shrink. So half of the time, it's not even if we sounded stupid, because I'll speak for myself. I don't think you sounded dumb at all in this episode. At least I didn't listen to the last one recently, but this one it's about how it flows. If anything, it's not You're not one of the notorious guests, so it's not like we're editing out 1,000 But all right. Speaking of I will let you go then. I've got to get this to Gerard to edit. Speaking of the Moore's Law is Dead team, and I just remind everyone, subscribe to this podcast on an app. Give us a review, that really helps. And if you have the money, you get this early and ad free if you support us the right tier on Patreon, and extra podcasts like Die Shrink. One came out this week early because this one came out later in the week than it usually does. But otherwise, tell your friends about us, and thanks again for coming on, Bryan, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Take care.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, If you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels: Brad Medlin, Anthony Gareffa, Dale Russell, Jeremy Scallon, Loophole 35, Thomas Rupp, I Love You Lynn, Jim Ivan K, Tom Bailey, Mohammed Al-Hawari, Eric Osborne, Jeff Sedler, Andre Jacques, Sarcastro, Terrence Herod, Drita Full, Phil S, D313337 Antics, Jackson A. Miller, Jesse Jaskowyak, Josh Law, Brandon, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Gaiman Since Reagan, Fatboy Desaru, Daniel Hyde, A Guy in PA 81, Nathan Mose, Cole Addict, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, F7GOS, Matthew Landavazo, My Name is Nobody, Judson N. Alethros, Jensen Wing, Hey There's a Kitty, Great G. Wanchek, Rentaro Matsukata, John Jameson, Sam Venzel, Matthew Lane, Mark Raidmaker, Jan Rauner, Chris Licata, Michael McGee, Meyer Techrans, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Patrick Groh, 3DS Boy 08, Dominique Cox, Stefan, Original Ross, Sandy Garrido, Saunderson, Joaquin Hagen, Teak Autumn, Solcaro, Michael Costa, Delmain Peterson, Z Chitz, Aaron Keith, Gregory S. Ecker, Hexapuma, Tom Sanfilippo, Justice Brennan, Zutsu Taylor, Trevor Power, Stu, Alenia, Nanan, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederick, Dan Galanowski, Ian Clifford, Axel Cisneros, Leighton Perry, Joseph Kierman, Brett Summers, Blake, Donovan Russell, Noah Colella, Zlicki, Matt Porshegi, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Hulam, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Stephen Coates, Kiwi Phil, Brucha, Jeremy So, Mitchell Pell, Silvanos, Eddie Del Castillo, Jacob Laster, Luis Correa, Deke, Chris P. Bakken, Tyler Lindley, Tim Robbins, Jake 223, Brian Riggleman, Justin Gower, Caillou Markelli, Dave McCoy, Valco Malev, Gabe Langner, Ronnie DNA Tech, Michael Dean, MJB1, Maurice Courtois, Wesley Sager, Chrysanthine, Mai Sharona Y, Trey Roman, William W. Draper, Air Rat, Spam G. Spamton, Henry Zhang, Stephen Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Greg, Peter Moore, Amiable Chief, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, Sammy Malas, James Anderson, Shakir, Nick Rakin, Holden Mobley, Matthew Lazier, Arpit Sharma, Meat and Pork, Jimmy NG, Mads, Matthew Lazier, Benjamin Oshley, Mark Mitchell, Shield TV, Kuto, Aaron, John Wisink, Mohammed, Jean DeBont, Pulse Media, Sean Ashmont, Daniel Dewar, Stephen Chang, JSMMH, Georgie Kastadanov, PC Beast 22, Reginald Airy, Narithiel, Ivan, Charles, Russell Howell, Buma Akarsh, Aditya, The Grid, Andrew S., Chris Rich, Powell Zigartowski, D. Sith, Zabbeat 03, and thank you to Sahara for the music.